Prologue. Lillian Nettles blushed as she sneaked into the schoolroom early. The teacher was already there writing lessons on the board. Lillian didn't want to be seen, so she tiptoed to the desk she was looking for and dropped the flowers and note onto the seat and ran from the room. She was only 11, but she was in love, and she had to let the object of her affections know about it. 20 minutes later, everyone wandered into the schoolroom. Lillian took her seat, her head down. She knew that he was about to find her present and note, and she said a quick prayer that he returned her affections. There was a scuffle from the boys' side of the room, and Lillian looked up to see Benedict's best friend, Arnold, with the flowers and the note. He was guffawing like only a teenage boy could. Lillian sank down further into her chair. Her face was flaming red as she heard Arnold read aloud the words she'd worked so hard to write. My dearest Benedict, I know we're too young to show our affections openly, but I needed you to know that you are the man I have chosen to be my husband someday. Every night before I go to bed, I kiss my pillow and I imagine it's you. I've even picked out the names for our children. Please say you'll wait for me. I know I'm younger than you, but surely that doesn't matter when love is true. All my love for the rest of my life. Lillian. The room erupted with laughter, and Lillian was mortified. She couldn't believe her most secret feelings were right there for everyone to see. How could Benedict have allowed Arnold to do that? She sneaked a peek at the object of her affection, and he was standing there, the tallest boy in the room, red-faced with embarrassment. He picked up the flowers and walked to the stove on the side of the room and threw them into it, his eyes cutting her across the room. Benedict took his seat, still shaking with embarrassment. What had boring little Lillian been thinking to leave that kind of note on his chair where anyone could read it? He was never going to marry her. He was never even going to be seen talking to her again. No, it truly wasn't going to happen. He just hoped he could live it down. All day, the boys teased him. At lunch, they suggested he go eat with his fiancée. They suggested she start bringing his lunch with hers. By the time school was out, Benedict was ready to refuse to ever return to the small one-room schoolhouse there in Beckham. How could he ever face the world again after what Lillian had done to him? When he got home, there she was in the kitchen with his sister, Gwen. They were eating cookies and talking softly. He heard Gwen say, I don't know if he'll ever forgive you. He's not a terrible brother, but he's awfully bossy and always has to have his own way. He wouldn't want a girl who told him he should marry her that way. Lillian looked up and saw him, tears trickling down her cheeks. Benedict, I'm so sorry. I never meant for anyone to read the letter. Benedict didn't respond. He held his head up as he walked to the stairs and up to his room. She was dead to him. Chapter 1. Benedict Blue looked around him as he strode down the main street of Beckham, Massachusetts. Nothing would ever be the same for him or his family. The deacons, who had wanted to marry his sisters, had seen to that. They seemed like such upstanding men until you got to know them. In the 2 years since his sisters had run from them, they had spread rumors that had ruined the Blue family business. Benedict scowled at the boards that had been nailed over the window of the mercantile he'd helped his father run. He wanted to shout and scream that things were unfair, but he knew there was no point. The anger would be wasted, and Benedict always did his best not to waste his energy on useless emotions. He crossed the street on his way to see Elizabeth Miller, the matchmaker who had sent his sisters to Texas as mail-order brides. She'd informed him and his brothers that the deacons were involved in something much worse than they'd imagined. They were slowly culling single ladies from Beckham and selling them into slavery. He'd never heard of such a thing, but he'd promised to be on hand for Elizabeth if she needed him until it was time for him to join his family. His younger brother, Hank, had already rescued 3 of the women and brought them to their sisters in Dalton, Texas. He'd even married one of them. The youngest brother, Percy, had escorted their parents to Dalton. Benedict was staying behind until their home was sold, and he was certain Elizabeth could handle things on her own for a bit before heading off to join them in Texas. He was about to turn the corner, when he saw a woman pressing herself against the wall of a restaurant, weeping copiously. He could only see the back of her, but she had curves in all the right places. He was an admirer of the female form, and she had a nice one. She was slim, with blonde hair that hung in ringlets down her back. He didn't recognize her at first, but when he did, he wanted nothing more than to cross the street and avoid her. Lillian Nettles. She'd been his sister Gwen's closest friend for as long as he could remember. And he'd never forgiven her. What she'd been thinking to embarrass him in front of the whole school, he would never know. It had been madness, and no one had ever let him live it down. Not a day had gone by for the rest of his school years that someone hadn't mentioned the note she'd left on his chair. His instinct was to abandon her and leave her to her own devices, but she was his sister's friend, and he was a gentleman. He stopped and put his hand on her shoulder, not wishing to touch her but not certain she'd be able to hear him over the sound of her loud sobbing. Lillian blinked at the person in front of her and almost fainted with relief. Bossy Benedict, as his sisters called him. He'd be able to make everything better. She brushed her hand under her eyes and looked at him. "I need help," she whispered. She knew she wasn't his favorite person in the world. She wasn't even his favorite person within a 10-foot radius. In fact, she'd be willing to bet she was his least favorite person in all of Beckham. No matter. She needed him, and he'd be there for her. He was Benedict after all. Benedict sighed. He had no desire to help her. Of all the women he could have happened across. "What do you need, Miss Nettles?" He kept his voice polite but cold. They were the first words he'd spoken to her since he was 15. Lillian made a face. Surely he didn't hate her too much to use her name. "Please call me Lillian, Benedict. We've known one another too long for formalities. I think it would be best if we kept things formal." "What do you need?" He wasn't going to stand there loitering on the corner for hours. He had things he needed to do that did not include Lillian Nettles. "Fine. Do you know the deacons? The ones your sisters were going to marry?" She knew he did, but she had to get his attention somehow. At the word deacon, Benedict's ears pricked up. Did she know something about their slave operation? "Yes, I do." Lillian sniffled, her eyes filling with tears again. "Well, they'd been after me for months to meet Deacon Smith's nephew. They said he'd be the perfect match for me. I told them no repeatedly." She shrugged. "Let's face it. Deacon Smith is no prize, and I really couldn't imagine wanting to be married to any of his relations." She didn't add that she'd sworn to herself she would remain a spinster until Benedict took her for his bride. She loved him far too much to seriously consider another man. Benedict nodded slowly. "So did you meet the nephew?" Lillian shook her head. "No, but a month ago my parents were killed in a fire." She sniffed loudly at that, pulling a handkerchief from her drawstring purse. "They left me alone for 3 weeks after that, but a week ago, they started pestering me to meet Deacon Smith's nephew again. I had no desire to meet him, but I'm all alone now. I was an only child, so there's no family to go to. I've never had a beau." Her eyes met his, trying to convey all the feelings she still had for him with a glance. Benedict grew uncomfortable and looked away. "So did you meet him?" She was taking forever to get her story out, and he was ready to be done with her. If she hadn't mentioned the deacons, he probably would have walked away already. "No, of course not. Weren't you listening?" She sighed. Benedict was an intelligent man, but he didn't seem able to follow a simple conversation. "I talked to them yesterday, and I finally agreed to meet him, not because I was interested in the man as a husband. No, I agreed to meet him because I wanted the deacons to leave me alone once and for all." Benedict kept his hands balled into fists at his sides. He could cheerfully wring the woman's neck, but he kept his temper in check. To think, he'd been admiring her figure just minutes before. Of course, he hadn't realized it was her then. "And did they leave you alone?" He knew the answer, but he wanted her to tell the story in her own way. Maybe she had some evidence against the deacons they could take to court. What they had was too flimsy to do anything with at this point. She shook her head. "No, because I went to see them today, to tell them I'd spoken in haste and wasn't interested in meeting Thaddeus, no matter how many nice things they said about the man." She paused, sucking in her breath and lowering her voice for effect. When I got to Deacon Smith's house, I heard them talking through the open window. It's a good thing for me it's spring, because if it had been winter, I never would have known. Anyway, one of them, I don't know which because I wasn't looking, said something that frightened me. You see, I flattened myself against the side of the house next to the window so I could hear them better. Don't you think that was smart, Benedict? Benedict closed his eyes and nodded. If she finished the story before supper time, he'd be thrilled. Of course, he hadn't had lunch yet, so he'd also be mighty hungry. Very smart. Lillian preened under his words. She was so happy that Benedict could finally see how smart she was. Maybe he'd change his mind about her after all. Do you know what I heard the deacon say? Benedict shook his head, not saying anything. He was afraid he'd yell if he found his voice again, and she was obviously frightened enough. Lord, the woman was exasperating. She dropped her voice to a whisper, stepping closer to him and putting her hand on his chest. He said that Thaddeus had promised them $1,000 for me, and that he had a buyer all lined up. She looked up at Benedict, her eyes wide. They were going to sell me. Benedict stared at her for a moment. They'd never actually been able to confirm their suspicions about the deacons with any real evidence. Now there was no doubt. He didn't mention it to her, but he was certain it had been the deacons who caused the fire. Why wouldn't they? There was money involved, and they knew the deacons would do anything for money. Would you walk with me, Lillian? He asked, dropping his use of her formal name. He needed to get her to Elizabeth Miller as soon as possible, so they could make plans to get her out of Beckham and away from the deacons. Lillian blushed as she reached for Benedict's arm. Those were words she'd waited her entire life to hear, since she'd first spotted him in the schoolyard when she'd started school at age 7. She'd known he was the man she would marry since that very day. I'd be honored. Benedict gave her a strange look, but he offered his arm, and she took it happily. Where are we going walking to? The park? I see courting couples in the park all the time. Benedict sighed. Now she thought he was courting her? He thought about giving her the setting down she deserved, but he knew it was better left for Elizabeth's house. They would talk when they arrived, and Elizabeth could help them. No, I was on my way to visit a friend and thought you might want to come along. He was introducing her to his friends? She wanted to squeal with excitement, but she simply smiled and walked beside him. She hoped her bonnet was on straight. She'd never dreamed Benedict would actually show an interest in her after all these years. Of course, she would never look at another man, so she was glad he was there. She didn't want to be alone forever. Benedict said nothing as they walked the 5 minutes to Elizabeth Miller's home. He wished he could say the same for Lillian. She chattered like a magpie the entire way, talking about how thrilled she was that he'd happened along, and how lonely it was living at the women's boarding house. She was just thankful her parents had been smart enough to put their money in the bank, because she knew many people who kept their money stashed under a mattress. She went on and on until he felt like throttling her. By the time they reached Elizabeth's house, he was ready to shout at her, but he didn't. He couldn't. She'd been through a hard time, and she was Gwen's best friend after all. They walked to the door, and he knocked loudly, praying the door would be answered expeditiously. He couldn't take much more of Miss Lillian Nettles. Chapter 2. Elizabeth came to the door herself, which surprised Benedict. Usually her butler answered the door. Oh, Benedict, come in. I've been expecting you. Who's your friend? Elizabeth, this is Lillian Nettles, a friend of Gwen's from school. Lillian, this is Elizabeth Miller. She's been helping me with a little project. He didn't mention what the project was, because he knew they needed time to break it to Lillian gently. It's nice to meet you, Miss Nettles, Elizabeth said, holding the door wide. Go ahead and take her to my office, Benedict. I'll be there in a minute after I ask the maid for tea and cookies. Benedict led Lillian through the huge house, taking her to the last door on the left. He didn't want to share the sofa with her, but unfortunately the only places to sit were Elizabeth's desk chair and the sofa. He sank down as close to one end as possible and stifled a groan when she sat right in the middle. Elizabeth entered the room and took her seat, turning to Benedict. Have you learned anything new about our friends? She worded her question as carefully as possible, not knowing why Lillian was there with them. Benedict nodded. I ran into Miss Nettles on the way here. She has an interesting story to tell. Elizabeth gave her full attention to Lillian. Do you know something about the deacons? Lillian's eyes widened. What did Elizabeth Miller know about the deacons? I think they want to sell me, she said in a loud whisper. Was it even polite to say such a thing? She didn't know, as she'd never learned the etiquette for such an odd situation. Elizabeth sighed. I was afraid of that. I'm glad you ran into Benedict then. Her eyes met Benedict's. We have to get her out of town, today. Her voice was calm, yet urgent. She obviously knew more about what the deacons were doing than Lillian did. He nodded. I know. Hank's already in Texas, though, and Percy has our parents to worry about. Do you have anyone else who can take her to Texas? He needed to get her to his sisters, who would offer her sanctuary and find her a good husband. Lillian looked back and forth between Elizabeth and Benedict. Texas? Why would I go to Texas? Elizabeth frowned. How much have you told her? Absolutely nothing. I've spent the last 10 years doing my best to say as little as possible to Lillian Nettles. As soon as he said the words, he regretted them, because Lillian's back stiffened, and she moved away from him on the sofa. He didn't want her close, but there was no reason to deliberately hurt her feelings either. He felt like a cad, but he'd had enough of her to last him a lifetime. Elizabeth looked back and forth between the two on her sofa, as if she was trying to understand what was happening between them. Finally, she gave her attention to Lillian. Do you want to tell me what happened? Lillian shook her head. I don't think I could. She looked at Benedict, her eyes pleading with him. Would you explain, please? Benedict shrugged before quickly relating everything she'd told him. When he finished, he said, I think you're right, and we need to get her out of town as quickly as we can. Elizabeth nodded, turning her full attention back to Lillian. We know that the deacons are kidnapping and selling women to a man named Thaddeus Slade. You were obviously about to be their next victim. They don't like when we remove the women thereafter, so we're going to need to get you out of town as quickly as possible. When are you supposed to meet the nephew? Tomorrow. Lillian was startled to hear she wasn't the only victim. But I can't just leave. I've never lived anywhere but Beckham. She couldn't imagine what life would be like elsewhere. She may have no one left, but better the evil she knew, right? Elizabeth frowned. You don't have a choice. If you stay in Beckham, they will get their hands on you. She looked at Benedict. You'll have to take her. No one else is available right now. Benedict crossed his arms over his chest. I'm supposed to stay here and make sure everything goes as it should with the sale of the house. I can't leave. Especially not with Lillian. She would make him crazy in the space of an hour. In fact, she already had. No, he wasn't traveling that far with Lillian, not unless someone held a gun to his head. I'll wire Percy and have him come back to Beckham. He should be in Texas by now. You need to take care of Lillian. Lillian shook her head adamantly. I can't travel with a man I'm not married to. It wouldn't be proper. She didn't look at Benedict as she said the words. He'd made it perfectly clear that he hadn't forgiven her for putting the note on his chair when they were children. How long would he hold a grudge for a childish act? Benedict sighed. I'll take her, but I'm not marrying her. He couldn't imagine being tied to her for the rest of his days. Lillian glared at Benedict. I don't believe I've asked you to. She looked back at Elizabeth. I can't travel with a man I'm not married to. Is there no one else who could escort me? An older woman perhaps? There's no one who knows how to handle a gun like I do, Benedict told her with a frown. Elizabeth's right. We need to get you out of town as quickly as possible, and you need to go with me. I can protect you. We don't know if the deacons are having you followed. Elizabeth shook her head. I don't think they would be yet. They think they've convinced her to meet the nephew, so she's going along with their plans. Why would they be following her? Lillian shook her head. I can't travel with an unmarried man. How many times did she have to say that before they listened to her? So you'd rather stay here and be sold? Really? Have you lost your mind? Lillian shrugged. So you concede that I have one to lose? We're getting somewhere, aren't we? How could she have thought he'd actually forgiven her? He was obviously the most hard-headed, unforgiving man to walk the face of the earth. Why, she wouldn't marry him if he were the last man. Oh, who was she kidding? She'd marry him if he grew a third eye in the middle of his forehead and began drooling uncontrollably. He sighed. Lillian, we've had our differences, but Gwen is your friend. I owe it to her to help you. He still felt guilty that he'd gone to Texas to drag his 3 sisters back to Beckham to marry the deacons. What if he and his brothers had succeeded? Where would their sisters be now? Lillian crossed her arms over her chest and glared at him, obviously not willing to back down. Elizabeth stood. Benedict, I really must speak with you privately about this. She led him to the hall and closed the door behind her. Lowering her voice, she said, marry her. Get an annulment once you reach Texas. She needs you to take care of her. Benedict choked. Marry Lillian Nettles? The woman who made me a laughingstock for years? There's no way. She was much too young to marry anyway. What was she? 13? Elizabeth put her hands on her hips and glared at him. So she did something as a child that offended you? Mortal embarrassment is more like it. And because of that, you'll allow her to be kidnapped and sold by the deacons? Really? I thought you were a better man than that. She closed her eyes and counted to 10. She'd thought much higher of the man in front of her. It'll take you 10 days to get to Texas, 2 weeks if you stop for a couple of days on the way. You can't be married to her, in name only, for 2 weeks, because she embarrassed you when you were a child? Really? Benedict sighed, realizing he'd lost. Fine. I'll marry her, but I won't like it. What was the world coming to? His school friends would have a wonderful time laughing uncontrollably when they heard. Lillian almost clapped her hands as she stood listening on the other side of the door. She hurried to the sofa and resumed her seat, trying her best to look innocent when they came into the room. Benedict glared down at her. Let's get married. He almost asked if she still remembered the names she'd picked out for their children, but he didn't want to add fuel to the fire. He needed to make it clear they wouldn't have a real marriage. This marriage will be in name only. We'll get an annulment as soon as we reach Texas. Lillian nodded, certain she could convince him otherwise during the trip. I suppose that's the best offer I'm going to get. She smiled. When will we marry? Benedict stared at her incredulously. Have you not been paying attention at all? We marry now. Like, I leave here to get a minister, and we marry here. Within the hour. And then we leave town. Immediately. She frowned. But I had to make all new dresses after the fire. I need my things. She wasn't vain, but she couldn't imagine going through all that work again. You're worried about dresses when you could be forced into slavery? Really? Elizabeth bit her lip as she watched them. She appeared to be trying not to laugh, and Benedict wanted to strangle both women. Excuse me. Where do you live, Lillian? Elizabeth asked softly, barely managing to keep the laughter from her voice. Lillian frowned at Elizabeth. At the ladies' boarding house near Benedict's family's mercantile, what used to be their mercantile. She looked at Benedict, guessing that was a sore subject with him. Sorry. Benedict shrugged, acting as if it was nothing. You didn't do it. I'm glad to see I'm no longer blamed for everything. Elizabeth interrupted again. Lillian, would you write a note for your landlady to pack up your things? Benedict can collect them for you. Lillian nodded slowly. I can do that. There's a carpet bag in my room she can put everything into. She frowned. I'll need to get money out of the bank for our journey. Write a note for the banker as well. I don't want you leaving this house until we're married and on our way to the train station. I'll take care of everything. He glanced at the clock on Elizabeth's mantle. We're going to be cutting it close as it is. Last train leaves at 4. Elizabeth frowned. I'll send a maid to fetch her things. You get the money and the preacher. Lillian quickly wrote out a note and handed it to Benedict, then wrote another for the maid. Benedict got to his feet, looking longingly at the tray of cookies and tea that had just been carried into the room. I'll be back as soon as I can. He reached out and grabbed a cookie, biting into it as he left the room. As soon as he was gone, Elizabeth looked at Lillian. You have got to tell me what you did to make Benedict hold a grudge for so long. It must have been terrible. Lillian rolled her eyes, explaining about the note and the bouquet of flowers. He's never really spoken to me since. Until today. And I spent a lot of time with his sister in their home. Elizabeth shook her head with a sigh. Men do hold grudges when their pride is involved. I see that. By the time Benedict returned with a pocket full of money and a preacher, the maid had brought Lillian her things. Lillian dressed carefully, having Elizabeth fix her hair for her. Maybe Benedict thought the marriage wouldn't last, but she knew she was marrying the man she'd loved for years, and she was going to look her best. She would never marry again. Benedict noticed that she'd changed, and she looked even prettier than before. He had to remind himself she was only 13 or so. She was much too young for him. He only faltered once during the ceremony. You may now kiss your bride, the preacher said with a huge grin. Benedict wrinkled his nose. Do I have to? If he kissed her, would she assume it meant he'd changed his mind and planned on staying married? Lillian gasped with shock and kicked him with her pointy boot. She smiled when he grunted in pain. Yes, you have to. She turned her lips up to his and offered them sweetly. Pretend you like me for a change. The preacher looked at Elizabeth. Why are they marrying if he doesn't like her? Elizabeth shrugged. It's not really my story to tell. Lillian ignored them both as she waited for Benedict to finally kiss her. The man was obstinate, but he had never seemed stubborn. She would stand there until next week waiting for him to kiss her if that's what it took. He stood for a moment staring down at her, a startled look in his eyes. Like he'd only just realized that marrying her meant kissing her, if only once. Finally, he lowered his head and brushed his lips across hers, before straightening. There. Is everyone happy now? Lillian shrugged. A longer kiss would have made me happier, but right now, I'll take what I can get. She turned to the preacher with a sweet smile. Thank you for coming here to marry us. The man looked thoroughly confused, but he chose to say nothing else. He just stood and watched the newlyweds for a moment. Elizabeth looked at the clock on the mantel. What time does your train leave? Benedict looked at the clock as well. At 4. We need to get to the station. He had sent a maid to get 2 changes of clothes for him from the almost empty house he'd grown up in. Percy could send the rest when he came back. He grabbed both of the bags that were on the floor beside the sofa. After you. Elizabeth had talked to Lillian about the dangers men can bring into women's lives. She gave her the usual speech she gave women about getting out of an abusive situation, but there was one difference. She told her to go to one of the Dalton women instead of coming back to Beckham. Like it or not, Lillian could not return to her hometown. Benedict carried their bags to the train station. Lillian talked the whole time about the people and things she'd miss. Are you certain I can't say goodbye to? I'm positive. You can't say goodbye to anyone. We don't want to draw attention to the fact that we're leaving. It's bad enough that you're walking with me to the train station. Now you know we have to tell anyone that we run into that you're just seeing me off, right? Lillian nodded slowly. I understand. You do realize I'm leaving everything and everyone I know and love, right? And I don't even get to say goodbye? Benedict refused to feel sorry for her. She had manipulated him into marriage. You'll survive. They reached the train station 5 minutes later, and he breathed a sigh of relief. He'd been wary the entire way, certain that one of the deacons would jump out from behind every tree to stop them. They arrived just in time to buy their tickets and board the train. I refuse to ride in the second-class car, Benedict. I want a private sleeping car. Benedict groaned. The last thing he wanted was to be in a sleeping car with Lillian. She would talk his ear off. I don't think that's a good idea. I thought you were worried about being seen? I think we should have privacy. She knew they couldn't consummate their marriage in the second-class car. He shrugged. I'm not paying for a sleeping car. Lillian dug into her purse and pulled out some bills. Here, pay with this. I don't care. A man had the right to all of his wife's possessions anyway. Benedict had once had enough money that he could just throw it away on things like sleeping cars. Now that they'd lost their business, he resented that she could easily throw money away on whatever she wanted. Just another reason to dislike her. They boarded the train and found their car. The sleeping area was tiny, but private. He really didn't want to spend the next week in a small room with her this way. The quarters were way too cramped. I think maybe I should ride in the main car. We have that option with the sleeping tickets. Lillian frowned. If he wasn't in the sleeping car with her, then her plan would be ruined, but I'll be frightened if I'm alone. She stepped close to him, her palm going flat on his chest. Please, Benedict. Gwen would want you to keep me safe. Benedict sighed. She was right. It was what Gwen would want, and he owed Gwen for almost forcing her to leave her happy marriage and go back to Beckham to be sold into slavery. Fine. I'll stay. He turned away from her to put his carpet bag on a chair. Rubbing the back of his neck, he looked at her. I haven't eaten all day other than that cookie I snatched before leaving to get the preacher. I'm going to go to the dining car. Lillian jumped up. She'd only had tea and cookies since breakfast. I'll go with you. I'm famished. She looked at him expectantly, wishing he'd offer his arm, but when he didn't, she followed him through the narrow corridor to the dining car. The more time she spent with him, the better chance there was that he'd fall in love with her. Right? Chapter 4. When they reached the dining car, Benedict pulled out Lillian's chair as he'd been taught to do. He took his seat across from her, wondering how he was going to make it through a trip with boring Lillian. Even before the fiasco with the flowers and the note, she'd annoyed him to no end. She was constantly following him around the house whenever she visited Gwen and making eyes at him. How such a little girl had decided she was in love with him, he'd never know. When he looked at her across the table, he saw the little girl she'd been, not the woman she'd become. He picked up the menu and read it while she picked up hers. Once he'd chosen his meal, he set the menu on the table, only to find her staring at him. He sighed. Lillian, I think it's time we set some rules for this trip. He couldn't have a child watching him the way Lillian did. It made him uncomfortable. He needed her to act like she had no feelings for him, whether she thought she did or not. Lillian shrugged. If I like the rules, then I'll agree to them. What kind of rules? She wasn't about to agree to any rules just because he said she should. The one thing Gwen had always been right about was how bossy Benedict was. Benedict wanted to throttle her. Couldn't she see the rules were for her benefit? First off, I don't want you looking at me that way. What way? Lillian had no idea what she was doing wrong. She'd looked at Benedict the same way since the day she'd met him. He may be her husband, but he wasn't about to mandate how she looked at him. Had the man lost his mind? Like you think I'm a cross between the most handsome man alive and a knight in shining armor. I'm just a man. Lillian nodded. You are a man. You're the man I've always dreamed I'd spend the rest of my life with, and to me you are a cross between the most handsome man alive and a knight in shining armor. I was crying on a street corner, and you made things better. How could I not think highly of you after that? Benedict shook his head. I did what I felt like I should do, because you're my sister's friend. Not what I wanted to do. He leaned forward. Do you want to know what I wanted to do when I saw it was you on that street corner? Lillian nodded hesitantly. Was he going to say something else designed to hurt her feelings and make her stop loving him? I suppose. She didn't though. She wanted to keep him on the pedestal she'd built for him. I wanted to cross the street and stay as far away from you as possible. As far as I'm concerned, you're a menace. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, Benedict regretted them. They were the truth, but why did he always feel the need to be so harsh with her? Lillian smiled, her hand reaching for his. By the time we get to Texas, I'm going to change your opinion of me, Benedict. She threaded her fingers through his. You'll see that I'm the wife you need. Benedict shook his head. Did you not hear a word that I said? He pulled his hand from hers, wiping it on his slacks, even though he knew it was childish. Everything she said and did brought out the child in him. I want you to stop touching me, Lillian. Lillian blinked. But it's our wedding day. Of course, I'm touching you. And you'll be touching me tonight, on our wedding night. That's why we have a private sleeping car. Didn't he know what was supposed to happen on their wedding night? Would she have to explain it to him? If they turned off the lights, she was certain she could make it through the explanation without feeling as if she'd expire from blushing. I told you I want an annulment, Lillian. We can't get an annulment if we've had relations, so I won't be touching you tonight or any other night. Lillian sat back in her chair and pouted. But we're married. We're only married until we reach Texas. Then we'll go our separate ways. Lillian didn't respond, but her mind was racing. He thought he could go the entire journey without touching her. She'd have to see what she could do about that. Benedict left the room while she readied herself for bed that evening. Everything Lillian did made him a little bit crazy. Why did she brush against him every time he walked across the room? Why was her hand constantly stroking him as she passed him? Why had she kissed his cheek earlier while he'd been reading the newspaper? Someone had given the girl lessons in being a temptress, but she wouldn't succeed in seducing him. She was only 13. He walked to the other end of the car and leaned against the wall, folding his arms over his chest. The girl was crazy, and that's all there was to it. Lillian wished she had a pretty nightgown with lace to change into for her wedding night, but all she had were the serviceable white gowns she'd made for herself since the fire. She missed her parents every day, but marrying Benedict would help fill the void in her life. She wasn't pleased with the events that had brought about her marriage to him, but she was still fulfilling a lifelong dream, and she was going to make the most of it. She changed into her nightgown, and climbed into the bed, fighting the urge to pull the covers over herself. No man had ever seen her so scantily clad, and she was nervous about it. Why, even her father had never seen her in just her nightgown without something covering her. She inched the fabric up her leg, just a bit, so her knee would show. She hoped that wasn't too much flesh to show her husband. She was a bit nervous about her wedding night. Her mother had always been open with her about what occurred between a husband and his wife. Her father hadn't liked it, but her mother hadn't believed girls should be kept in the dark about such things. She trusted Benedict, and she knew relations with someone else would make her skin crawl, but they'd barely kissed. She had no idea what to expect from him. When the door slowly opened, she looked at his face, wondering what he'd think of her in her nightgown. Would he be repulsed by her? Benedict looked at her lying on the bed and blinked a few times. Why was she looking at him that way? And why on earth wasn't she covered up like she should be? Cover yourself. Lillian looked at him with a smile. Aren't you going to join me? She wished her mother had told her more about how to get a man's attention in this kind of situation, but really? What kind of mother would do such a thing? She rolled to the far side of the narrow bed to make room for him to join her. Benedict was shocked to realize he actually wanted to join her, but he knew it was just a physical reaction. He couldn't sleep in that bed with her. He slowly shook his head. I'll sleep in the top bunk. There's no room for me there. Without bothering to undress, he climbed the ladder to the top bunk and laid atop the covers with his hands folded over his chest. Benedict? Lillian asked, doing her best to contain the tears. Aren't you going to dot, you know? Benedict swallowed hard. She was too young for him. He had to keep reminding himself that she'd driven him crazy. He waited for a bit, and when he finally answered, his voice was harsh. No, I'm not going to join you. We're getting an annulment as soon as we reach Texas. Remember? Lillian pulled the covers over herself, humiliated by his attitude. She rolled to her stomach and buried her face in her pillow. She wasn't certain what she'd done wrong, but it must be something. She'd figure it out, and tomorrow night, they'd have their wedding night. It was probably for the best anyway. She should get used to his kisses, before they made love, shouldn't she? Benedict rose early the next morning and went to use the facilities. When he came back, he looked at his wife. It was hard to believe he'd tied himself legally to the one woman he would have preferred to turn his back on. She was sprawled on her back, one hand beside her face on the pillow. Her covers had been shoved to the floor, and her nightgown had ridden up to mid-thigh. She looked beautiful lying there, and much older than she actually was. He was certain she was still 13, wasn't she? The stirrings of his body made him feel guilty, so he picked up the cover from the floor and threw it over her, sinking down into a chair across their tiny room from her, careful to keep his eyes off her. How could someone he detested as much as he loathed Lillian make him feel so much? He wanted to curse his body as it betrayed him. Lillian came awake slowly, too hot in the small room. She pushed the blanket to the floor and rolled to her side, tucking her hands under her cheek. She moaned, feeling the ache in her back from sleeping on the unfamiliar bed. Slowly she lifted her lashes, and saw Benedict sitting across the room from her. She knew she should be embarrassed at her state of undress, but he was her husband. Surely he'd have to see her in her nightgown, for their marriage to be consummated. She sat up in bed, stifling a yawn. "What time's it?" she asked. Benedict looked at his pocket watch, careful not to look at her. She was sitting with her legs crossed in front of her, paying no mind to the way her nightgown left most of her bare. Even the top of the gown had come unbuttoned, and he could see the side of her breast poking out. He averted his gaze again, cursing himself for looking at her. "It's almost 8. Time for us to head to the dining car for breakfast." They'd established that she was not to leave the room on her own, even to make use of the facilities. He would wait outside the door for her, because they couldn't be certain the deacons didn't have someone on the train watching them. Lillian nodded, stretching one arm above her head until it bumped into the bunk above her. She got out of the bed and dug into her carpet bag for one of the new dresses she'd made. Everything she owned at this point was new, because most everything had burned up in the fire. It had been fortunate that she'd been out at a church party for the young people when the fire had occurred. Not that she felt fortunate. Her heart sank as she thought of her parents. She couldn't help but wonder if they'd have approved of what she'd done to escape the clutches of the deacons. They certainly hadn't wanted her to meet Deacon Smith's nephew. "I wonder if my mama would be upset that I ran away so fast instead of standing to face the deacons." Benedict looked up to see her standing there, looking down into her carpet bag, a lost expression on her face. "Your parents would have wanted you safe. They would have done anything to keep you safe. You know that." He hadn't known her parents well, but he'd had dealings with her father from the mercantile. He'd been a good man, and he'd loved Lillian. Lillian felt a tear trickle down her face, and she quickly brushed it away. "I still can't believe they're gone." He stood and walked to her, pulling her into his arms. He knew it wasn't smart with the state he was in, but he couldn't just let her cry. "I know it's hard. I can't imagine feeling alone in the world as you must." He stroked her back softly, as he had for his younger sisters when they'd cried. "I don't feel alone anymore. I have you now." Benedict groaned, feeling like a heel. He didn't want her forever. He didn't even want her for the next hour, but he was all she had. He'd make the most of it. "I'm going to step out into the corridor while you dress. We'll go to breakfast in a moment." Lillian nodded, watching him go. She didn't care what he said. He was going to be her husband for the rest of her life. She couldn't imagine a day without him. She'd thought she'd loved him as a little girl, but now? He'd rescued her, and she was keeping him. That's all there was to it. Benedict tried to bring up her behavior of the previous evening over breakfast. "Lillian, I told you we're getting an annulment as soon as we reach Texas and my sisters. You need to keep yourself clothed around me. I'll give you time to get into bed each evening, but you need to cover up before I come back into the room." "But why?" You're my husband. It's all right for you to see me unclothed. I know what happens between a husband and wife. Her eyes met his, and she smiled sweetly. I'm more than willing to be a good wife to you, Benedict. He sighed. Then be an obedient wife and keep covered, will you? She reached out and stroked the back of his hand lightly with one finger. I want to be close to you. Will you share my bunk tonight? She leaned forward and put her lips to his ear. I can explain what we're supposed to do if you don't know. Benedict looked down at where she was stroking him, feeling the electricity shoot through his body at her touch. He decided to ignore her offer of an explanation of what occurred between a man and wife. The woman was insane if she thought he didn't know that. I can't share your bunk. We're getting an annulment and I need to leave you pure for the man you'll spend the rest of your life with. No, you don't. Even if you set me aside once we reach Texas, I'll never marry anyone else. For me, you're the only man. I thought you knew that. How could he not know that? She'd told him years before and had never changed her behavior toward him. He shook his head emphatically. You're too young for me. You're only 13. Lillian blinked a couple of times before laughing out loud. 13? I'm 21. Why do you think I'm 13? He looked at her with fresh eyes. She didn't look 13, but he knew she must still be. You can't be 21. I'm the same age as Gwen. She's married and has a little girl. Benedict scowled. He didn't like to think of his younger sisters married with children. No man should have touched them. They were much too young for that. She was a child bride. I can't believe the man married her. Walton Dalton is a crazy man to marry a child like her. Lillian let out a giggle. Walton Dalton? I knew his name was Walt Dalton, but I thought it was short for Walter. Who would name their child Walton Dalton? It would be like you naming your child Drew Blue. Benedict let out a snort. Drew Blue? That's awful. Remind me to tell whomever you marry not to allow you to come up with the children's names. Lillian sat back with a frown, all laughter leaving her face. I'm staying married to you. In fact, I would be more likely to name a child Drew Blue than I would be to let you set me aside. Benedict leaned forward earnestly. I told you how it would be before we left Beckham. Why was she trying to go back on their arrangement now? You told me what you wanted. I don't believe I ever agreed to anything. She didn't care what he said. He would have to throw her out of his life to get her to leave. She loved him, and she was going to stay with him for as long as he'd have her. You didn't disagree. I took that as unspoken agreement. You were mistaken. I didn't argue, because we were in a hurry. I'm not arguing now either. I'm telling you that I will do whatever it takes to stay your wife. She blotted her mouth with her napkin. Breakfast was wonderful. Would you like to go back to our room now and consummate our marriage? Benedict stared at her in disbelief, not quite certain how to respond. You can't just say that to me, he finally got out. He was certain she was a virgin, but she was the boldest young woman he'd ever spoken to. How had she become so brazen? Why not? It's what I want. She smiled sweetly. I've been told the marriage bed is very pleasurable, especially for the man. I'm happy to share that pleasure with you, Benedict. Benedict stood, threw his napkin on the table, and stormed from the dining car. The waiter appeared beside Lillian immediately. Is everything all right, miss? Everything is wonderful, she said as she got to her feet. And it's Mrs. Benedict Blue. She was never going back to being a miss again. She didn't care what Benedict had to say about it. Chapter 5. Benedict was waiting outside the dining car for her. I knew you wouldn't have gone too far. You're far too chivalrous to allow me to go back to our room on my own when my life is in danger. She took his arm, which he hadn't offered, and started to walk back toward the sleeping car. I do think I enjoy train travel. The constant movement is odd, but I like it. Lillian, you're going to have to behave. I inquired about another sleeping car, or even a seat in the main car, but there's nothing available. The train is completely full. Lillian smiled, resting her cheek against his shoulder as they walked. I'm certainly not going to complain about that. I'd rather share a room with you. Every day for the rest of our lives. When they reached their private quarters, he slid the door open. We can't go on this way, Lillian. I need your word that you'll stop throwing yourself at me. I don't want to do something we'll both regret. She reached around him and slid the door closed, taking another step toward him that left him with his back against the door. I have no intention of stopping anything, dear husband. Do you know why? She put her palms flat onto his chest, moving even closer until there was almost no space between them. Benedict couldn't believe how aggressive she was being. She'd always been so meek around him. Why? He asked warily. Because I would regret nothing, she said as she drew his head down for a kiss. Benedict was lost in her eyes for a moment and accepted the kiss. It took him all of 3 seconds to realize that kissing her was the last thing he wanted to be doing. No, he said, thrusting her away from him. She just smiled, feeling as if she'd won. Later then, my love. Benedict shook his head at her. Had he really shackled himself to this woman for the time it would take to get to Texas? Lillian spent most of the day sewing. When her landlady had packed her belongings, she'd put the sewing materials Lillian had purchased into her bag. She had the makings of several dresses, so she knew she wouldn't be bored. Benedict sat with a newspaper in front of him. Every time the train stopped, he'd get out for a few minutes and walk around, telling her he was making certain no one was following them. Lillian would just sit quietly and sew with the door locked, and she'd open it again upon his return. On one of his sojourns into the world outside the train, Benedict went to the local telegraph office, sending 2 telegrams. The first was to Elizabeth Miller. On our way stop, all is well, stop, nothing else was needed. Elizabeth would know who it was from and understand. The second telegram, to his sister Gwen, was more complicated. Married Lillian, stop, deacons after US, stop, find her good man, stop, need fast annulment, stop. He knew his sister would be unhappy with the missive, but he didn't know what else to do. He had to get away from Lillian before he did something they'd both regret. That time when he returned to the train, Lillian was lying on her side on the bottom bunk, sound asleep. He couldn't believe how beautiful she'd become over the years. She couldn't possibly be the girl he'd rejected, could she? She didn't look 13 anymore at all, but there were times when he could see the girl she'd been on her face. He was torn in how he felt. She was a temptress offering her body at every occasion, but he knew he'd never forgive her for their past. What was a man to do? When it was time for dinner, Benedict offered to leave the room so she could freshen up, using the pitcher and bowl provided for them. Why don't we just stay in the room for supper? I could put one of the blankets on the floor, and we could have a nice romantic picnic. Lillian wanted as much time alone with him as she could get, and the only time she seemed to have his full attention was during meals. Benedict shook his head adamantly. No. No to the romance and no to the picnic. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Be ready to go to the dining car. He shut the door behind him, still in disbelief. How many times would the woman throw herself at him in the 5 days it would take to get to Kansas? They would have a 2-day stop in Topeka, and then they would switch trains to go south, toward Texas. He hoped he could find a way to get adjacent sleeping cars for the next leg of their journey, and he would see about that as soon as they arrived in Topeka. As it was, he'd only been able to reserve 1 room at the thriving hotel in Kansas. He'd stayed there once before and loved it, become fast friends with the owner, so he'd decided it would be a good place to take a break from Lillian on their way. An older gentleman nodded to him as he stood with his back to the door in the corridor. You waiting on your wife for dinner? I promise you, out of the next 50 years, you'll wait on your wife for at least 10 of them. Benedict smiled. He started to tell the old man that he wasn't married, but he was. I thank you for your advice. We were just married yesterday. He did want to keep the illusion of newlyweds in love going. The more people that believed it, the better. No one would be looking for a young couple in love. The old man smiled. You enjoy your honeymoon, young man. Nothing better than the first few months of marriage when your wife still believes you know everything. Why, in another few months, she's going to know you know nothing, and she'll tell you every day. Benedict laughed softly as the older man walked off down the corridor, leaning heavily on his cane. He obviously had once been very much in love, and unless Benedict was mistaken, he still was despite his words. He gave her 10 minutes before opening the door. She'd dressed in a lavender dress for dinner, and her hair was twisted up into a knot atop her head. "You look lovely," he said without thinking. He was looking at her through a new husband's eyes after talking to the older man, and he knew better. Lillian's eyes lit up at his words. "Thank you." She took his arm and walked with him toward the dining car. "How long before we reach Texas?" she asked, wondering just how long she'd have to make him fall in love with her. She really needed to plot out her strategy. "It's a 10-day ride by train, but we're spending 2 days in Kansas. If anyone's searching for us, they won't think to look there." "Oh? Somewhere you know?" Benedict nodded. "There's a hotel there. It was once a mansion built by a gold miner who struck it rich. He ran out of money and went back to the mines where he was killed. The mansion was vacant for several years, and the man who bought it renovated it and turned it into a fine hotel and restaurant. I stayed there once before, when I was doing some traveling for pleasure. I know Adam will help us in any way he can. We became friendly on my last visit." Lillian nodded. "Is Adam married?" "Oh yes, he has a lovely wife, Elizabeth. They have children, but don't ask me how many." Lillian shook her head. Why did men never remember people's children? "I'd love to get to know her." "They have a daughter around your age. She may be a couple of years younger." He shrugged, not remembering the age of the girl, but knowing she was 13 or so. "Does she still live with her parents then?" "Of course. She's not old enough to be on her own." Lillian shrugged. Was he back to thinking she was 13? She wondered if she bared herself to him if he'd finally understand she wasn't a child any longer. He pulled her chair out for her once they reached the dining car, before sitting opposite her. "Are you hungry?" She nodded. "Absolutely famished. It's odd having all my meals served to me, though. Even at the boarding house, we all had chores, and one of mine was helping to serve the meals. Enjoy it while you can. There aren't a lot of luxuries in Texas, I'm afraid. Tell me about Gwen's life now. Does she like Texas?" Benedict nodded, taking a sip of the water the waiter placed on the table in front of him. "She does. Her husband dotes on her. He's a good man, if a bit arrogant." "Arrogant? Why do you say that?" "He's gone and named the town that's growing up around his ranch Dalton after himself. He talks all the time about the empire he's building and how Gwen will be the empress of that empire." Benedict rolled his eyes. "I've never met anyone quite like him. He sounds interesting. He loves Gwen, though?" For Lillian, that was the bottom line. If Gwen's husband loved her, any other faults could be ignored. "Oh, absolutely. I've never seen a man more in love than Walt." "What about Savannah? Is she sweet?" Benedict shrugged. Like most men, he didn't really understand the fuss about babies. "She's a good baby. Pretty. What else was there to say? I can't wait to hold her. And Savannah is such a pretty name. At least they didn't rhyme her name with Dalton." Lillian grinned. "I'm naming our first son Drew. I promise you this." Benedict laughed softly. "There will be no Drew Blue in my life." For once, he decided to let it go that she believed them having a son was a foregone conclusion. For dinner tonight, just for this one meal, he wanted to believe there could be a future. That old man in the corridor had made him think about being with one woman for the rest of his life. But it's such an incredible name. Almost as good as Walton Dalton. Their meal was brought then, so he sat back while the waiter placed their plates in front of them. Picking up his fork, he said, either that man's parents had no imagination or ridiculous senses of humor. "I'm not sure which theory I prefer." Lillian giggled as she stabbed a potato with her fork. "I don't know either, but I aim to ask him once I meet him. I have to know." I don't know how he'll take to you asking about his name that way, but let me know what he says, would you? Benedict wouldn't admit it, but he found the oldest of the Dalton brothers slightly intimidating. He wasn't certain why. They ate the rest of their meal in silence, but it was a comfortable silence for a change. Lillian was thrilled with his change in attitude and wanted to ask him what had brought it about. Once they reached their quarters that evening, she settled in to work on the dresses some more. She wished she'd had time to buy several books before leaving Beckham, because she only had one novel with her and her Bible. She was a Christian, but there was no way she could read the Bible the entire journey. Would you save me the newspaper when you're finished? She asked. Benedict looked at her in surprise. You read the newspaper? When I have nothing else to read, I do. I love to read. I'd be happy to save it. He hadn't really thought of her as a reader, but he was pleasantly surprised to hear it. His new bride surprised him more all the time. What else was hidden under her surface? Thank you. I plan to get a newspaper from every stop. I can save them all. I just want to make sure there are no articles about your disappearance reaching out this way. I wouldn't put it past the deacons to make it look as if you'd been taken against your will. Lillian shuddered. I forgot about them for a little while. Benedict shook his head at her. We can't ever forget them. We have no idea what they'll do next. Chapter 6. Lillian couldn't stop thinking about what Benedict had said about the deacons possibly looking for her through local newspapers. Would he tell her if he found something? She thought he would, but she just couldn't be certain. Every time he left the train for the next 2 days, she worried that he would come back with bad news. It was late on their 4th day on the train when he got back on, and she stood wringing her hands as he flipped through the paper. Anything? She asked. He shook his head. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit. They may not be smart enough to think about doing something like that. Lillian breathed a sigh of relief. I'm getting really nervous. Benedict got to his feet and walked to her. He'd been careful not to touch her when they were alone, only offering his arm in public because it was expected of newlyweds, and he felt the need to keep up appearances. He reached out and stroked her upper arm, trying to convey his concern for her with just a touch. Don't fret so much. We'll get off the train in Topeka tomorrow and spend a couple of days. I'll find out what I can while we're there. Adam will help us. He's a good man. Lillian nodded, taking a step forward and resting her head against his shoulder. For once, her touch was for no more than her own comfort. She'd tried for days to get him to kiss her, but he kept her at arm's length. Maybe that will help. I just feel so lost. I've lost my parents, and now the only town I've ever lived in within a few short weeks. It's like I have nothing left in the world besides you. And you don't even want me, she added silently. Benedict wrapped his arms around her and comforted her like he would have any of his 3 sisters. She'd really been through a lot, and if he could help her at all, he would. I'm sorry. I know it's been hard for you. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them show. I think I'm ready to be off this train for a day or 2. I need to remember what it feels like to walk without something rumbling under my feet. He dropped a kiss atop her head. You'll feel better once we're settled in Texas. I'm sure Gwen will be excited to see you. I'll telegraph her from Topeka. She turned her face up to his, suddenly aware that he was touching her. Whether he was doing it in a comforting way or not, she was determined to take advantage of his nearness. She pressed a kiss to his jaw, and when he looked down at her, she rose onto her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. Lillian had always been tall, but Benedict was one of the tallest men she knew. Benedict forgot who it was in his arms after one look into her lovely blue eyes. He pulled her closer to him, taking over the kiss immediately. His tongue traced the outline of her lips before seeking entrance. Lillian gasped at the feel of his tongue, but she obediently opened her mouth for his kiss. She loved him, and she was willing to do anything for him. Her hands went to his shoulders, and she stroked them through the thin fabric of his shirt. Benedict let out a low groan as he gathered her still closer, her breasts flattened against his chest. She felt so good against him. All he could think about was lowering her to the bed that was only a few feet behind her and covering her with his body. He raised his head and looked down into her eyes, all at once remembering where he was and who he was with. No, Lillian. I need to be able to get that annulment. His words weren't as strong as before. He was wavering, but it wasn't right. She was too young for a sexual relationship. He pulled away from her. I'm going to go use the facilities. You get ready for bed. His voice was low and gruff, the passion in it obvious. Lillian watched him go, startled by his abrupt departure. Her hand went to her lips to touch them. Benedict had kissed her, and she'd liked it. She smiled slowly. They'd be in a real bed the next couple of nights. Topeka, Kansas, would be the place where she would become his wife in every sense of the word. She just knew it. Pull your bonnet lower to hide your face, Benedict hissed at Lillian as they joined the masses exiting the train. He carried both of their bags while she walked with her head down. I know you want to see everything, but you can't be seen. Why couldn't he get it through her head that she had to be careful? She was his responsibility, at least for the next week, and he was going to make certain she arrived safely. He led her to a mansion with a large sign reading Brody Hotel out front, located next door to the train station. This is the hotel. Lillian looked up at the house with a smile. It's beautiful. Do you think they'd give me a tour if I asked? Benedict nodded. I'm sure Elizabeth would love to show the place off. She's very proud of it. He hurried her up the walk and into the lobby of the hotel. He spotted Adam at the front desk and rushed to him, his hand outstretched. Good to see you again. Adam smiled. Good to see you as well. And you brought your bride? Benedict frowned. He couldn't deceive his friend, but he'd tell him the entire story later. We'll talk. He nodded to Lillian. This is my wife, Lillian. Lillian, this is Adam Brody. He's the owner of the hotel. Lillian offered her hand. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Brody. Call me Adam. Adam looked at Benedict again. You two will be our guests for supper in the dining room tonight. Elizabeth and I would love to get to know your bride better. In his 40s, Adam was tall with blonde hair. Benedict nodded slowly. We'd enjoy that. Which room did you put us in? He looked around the hotel and could see slight changes since his visit just a year before. Business seems to be booming. Oh, it is that. You're in room 7. He looked around. Everyone appears to be busy. I'll take you up myself. He led the way up the stairs to the second floor, and took them to a door at the end of the hallway. This is my favorite room, so I made sure it was available for you and your wife, Benedict. Benedict smiled, shaking the other man's hand. So glad you did. Lillian was amazed at the room. Why, it's so grand. Everything about the room was elegant. She walked to the window and looked out, seeing the train station below them. She was not looking forward to getting on another train in a couple of days. Benedict smiled at her. Why don't you rest for a bit, while I go talk to my friend? I'll be back soon. He gave her a serious look. Lock the door behind me. I will. Lillian hurried to lock the door when the men left, and then she looked around the room. She'd never stayed anywhere half as luxurious. Her parents had been well off, but not what anyone would term rich. This was definitely a treat. She decided to take Benedict's advice, and after giving herself a quick washing with the pitcher of water provided, she climbed into the bed and closed her eyes. She'd gotten used to the motion of the train under her, but it was simply delightful to be somewhere that was completely still. She fell asleep with a smile on her face as she thought about what Topeka would mean to her and Benedict. Benedict waited until he and Adam were alone to explain the situation. I had to marry her, you see. We'll get it annulled once we reach Texas. Adam scratched his head after listening to Benedict's long explanation of the deacons and why they'd been forced to marry. Why would you get an annulment? She's a beautiful woman, and she seems kind and sweet. Why not stay married? Benedict held his hands up as if to ward off the other man's words. I couldn't do that. She's much too young. She's only 13. Adam raised an eyebrow. She's at least 20. There's no way that woman is 13. Benedict shrugged. She's the same age as my sister Gwen. Didn't you tell me your sister Gwen is married with a baby? Adam looked at Benedict as if he'd lost his mind. Well, sure, but Gwen is only 13. I don't know why Mama and Papa were going to marry her to the deacons. And they were going to marry her to the deacons 2 years ago. Isn't that right? Adam's look was incredulous. Well, sure. How old are you, Benedict? 25. And how many years younger than you is your sister Gwen? Adam talked patiently, almost as if Benedict were a child. Let's see. We're all about a year apart. Bonnie is 26, I'm 25, Hank's 23, and Percy's 22. Benedict's eyes widened as they met Adam's. That makes Gwen 21? But there's no way. Adam shook his head at his friend. Your wife is 21, which makes her a good age for you, Benedict. Why did you think she was 13? Benedict shrugged, trying to come up with a good reason, but he wasn't certain he had one. I really don't know. I just never saw her or Gwen as being older than 13. Well, they certainly are. You may need to look at your wife again. I still can't stay married to her. Well, she's a bit crazy. Benedict wasn't sure he should tell Adam the entire story, but what would it hurt? His friend had to understand why he couldn't stay married to Lillian. Adam looked at Benedict waiting for him to tell him more, but when Benedict remained silent, he finally said, "Why is she crazy?" Benedict told the story of what had happened back in their school days, with Lillian leaving the flowers and note on his chair. I've never been so embarrassed in all my life. Adam blinked a few times at Benedict. You do realize that happened 10 years ago, right? No one remembers that anymore. I do. The other boys teased me right up until we graduated. And you're still holding it against her? Really? Well, not really, I don't think. She's just not someone I ever planned to spend my life with. Adam sighed heavily. What are you thinking, man? You're married to a beautiful woman who all but worships you. And you're talking about getting an annulment because of a note she sent you when she was a child? Are you joking? You need to take a good look at her before you let her, and your chance for happiness, slip through your fingers. He shook his head. I don't like to say this to my friends, but you're being incredibly stupid. Benedict frowned. Was he really being stupid? I'll think about what you've said. You do that. Don't push her away just because you think she's crazy. Kids do silly things sometimes. Thanks. Benedict shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. You'll keep your eye out for someone looking for her? Adam nodded, clapping his hand on Benedict's shoulder. You know I will. We'll do anything to help you protect her. I'm going to go wire my sister and the woman helping us back home. I need the girl who sent us off together to know we're safe. And Gwen is going to go nuts to see her friend. As he walked out of the hotel and down the street, Benedict couldn't quit thinking about what Adam had said. Was he being stupid? Chapter 7. Lillian woke alone in the room. She peered out the window and saw that the sun was low in the sky. It must be almost supper time, but Benedict hadn't yet returned. She worried for a moment that something had happened, but she knew she was being silly. She changed into a nice dress for supper and slipped on her shoes. She sat at the little table in one corner of the room and picked up her sewing. She'd completed an entire dress on the train, and was almost finished with a second one. She was so sick of sewing she wanted to scream, but she refused to have idle hands. She needed to stay busy, or her mind would do crazy things. She couldn't dwell on the deacons and what they'd planned for her. When the door finally opened, Benedict stood staring at her as if he'd never seen her before. She jumped to her feet and went to him. Did you get the telegram sent? He nodded, looking at her with new eyes. How old are you? Lillian smiled. 21. How did you get to be so old without me noticing? He reached out and stroked her cheek, wondering about what Adam had said to him. After sending the telegrams, he'd just walked for a while, trying to come to grips with the truth. Lillian laughed. 21 is hardly old. But, the last time I talked to you, you were a child. He looked utterly baffled, and that just made him more lovable to Lillian. That's because you quit talking to me for 10 years. She sighed. Benedict, I'm very sorry I embarrassed you all those years ago. I don't know what made me think it was a good idea to leave that note on your chair. You've become a beautiful woman, Lillian blew. Lillian blushed. What had come over him? I look just the same as I did yesterday. But yesterday I saw you as a child. Now I realize you're a woman. He moved his hand from her cheek around to the back of her neck, pulling her slowly toward him. A very kissable woman who just so happens to be my wife. Lillian put her hands on his shoulders, still not certain what had brought about this change, but not willing to think about it. She was too pleased. A woman who is more than willing to be kissed by the man she loves. The man she married. She took the step that brought her body into contact with his. Kiss me, Benedict. For the first time, Benedict kissed her with everything he had. All of the emotions he'd been suppressing and all of the passion he felt for her. 5 days of constantly being in her presence had his body on fire. He pulled her even closer as his lips ravaged hers. His tongue went into her mouth even as his hands cupped her bottom and pulled her hips into contact with his. Lillian could feel his desire through his pants and her skirt. She didn't know what had changed in him, but she liked it. She felt like a married woman for the first time. Benedict let out a groan and lifted his head. We're supposed to be downstairs for supper in 5 minutes. Lillian shook her head. I'm not hungry. She reached for him and pulled him back down for yet another kiss. Benedict took a step back. There's nothing I want more than to lay you down on that bed and make you my wife in every way, but my friend is waiting downstairs. He ran his hand along the back of his neck. We need to go down and eat with Adam and Elizabeth. Lillian sighed, walking over to the window and looking out. It's not because you don't want to? Benedict laughed, the sound harsh as it echoed throughout the room. There's nothing in this world I want more, but Adam is helping us. We need to be polite and go to supper. He walked to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. We have 2 days and 2 nights here. I promise you an annulment won't be possible by the time we leave Topeka. Lillian could see their reflection in the window, because it was already dark outside. She loved the way they looked together. I hope so. A few minutes later, they walked into the dining room on the first floor of the hotel, Lillian holding to his arm. She felt like a wife for the first time since she'd married him, and she couldn't be happier. She saw Adam standing beside the most beautiful woman she'd ever seen and smiled as they reached the other couple. Elizabeth took a step forward, hugging the younger woman and kissing her cheek in greeting. Adam told me Benedict had married. I can see why now. It's so nice to meet you. Benedict speaks very highly of you and your husband. Lillian felt shy and ugly beside the other woman. We're going to be fast friends. I can feel it. Come sit beside me, and we'll talk. Elizabeth moved to a table set for 4 in one corner of the restaurant and waited as Adam pulled her chair out for her. Lillian took her seat between Elizabeth and Benedict, smiling as Benedict held her hand where it rested on the table. He hadn't done anything like that before, and she was thrilled about the change. How long have you and Adam been married? She asked softly. 15 years, Elizabeth said with a smile. I came to work here as one of the maids before the hotel even opened. It was a mess and needed a great deal of renovating. It's a beautiful hotel. Lillian looked around the dining room, loving the beautiful building. Elizabeth nodded. It certainly is. We're quite proud of it. Do you have children? Lillian asked. She wanted nothing more than to have a baby of her own. Well, she wanted Benedict to love her as well, but having a baby would just make her feel so much more like a wife. We have 3, Elizabeth said with a smile. Rose is our oldest at 15 and a half. She won't let me leave off that half. Then there's Gabriel who is 13, and Hope is 10. Lillian wondered at the age of Elizabeth's oldest daughter, but she didn't ask. It wasn't any of her business really. I can't wait to meet them. I'll make certain you meet them tomorrow. In fact, why don't we have a family dinner tomorrow evening with the two of you and our entire family, including the children? Lillian nodded her agreement. That sounds lovely. I'd be thrilled to meet your children. She eyed the other woman. You look too young to have a 15-year-old daughter. Elizabeth smiled. I like hearing that. I'm definitely old enough though. She leaned close to Lillian, and Adam is ancient. He's 40. Lillian put her hand over her mouth to stifle a giggle. You shouldn't say that. She wondered if she'd ever feel comfortable enough with Benedict that she could tease him so openly in front of others. Oh, I tell him that all the time. It's fun teasing him. Elizabeth sat up properly and took a sip of her water. So how did you and Benedict meet? We were in school together. One of his younger sisters was my best friend. Oh, that's nice. So he was your schoolhouse sweetheart? Lillian choked on the laugh that tried to escape. Well, I wanted him to be, but he hated me. She sighed dramatically, trying to make it seem as if he'd broken her heart. Benedict glared at Lillian. Do you want to tell her why I hated you? I would love to. Thank you for giving me permission to talk about it. She turned back to Elizabeth. You see, from the time I started school at 7, I had a crush on Benedict. By the time I was 11, I could think of nothing and no one else. I was worried he'd run off and marry someone else, so I decided I should let him know how I felt. Elizabeth's eyes were dancing with humor as she listened. She obviously understood the way Lillian's mind worked. Telling him would never have worked. Oh, of course not. I needed it to be a grand gesture, and at 11, the only grand gesture I could think of was leaving a bouquet of flowers on his seat at school. And a note. Benedict added. Yes, the note. Well, in this note, I declared my undying love for him. I told him if he'd wait for me, we'd marry, and that I'd already picked out the names of our future children. I wrote and rewrote that note 50 times over the course of 2 weeks. Finally, when it was just perfect, I left it with the flowers on his chair. Elizabeth covered her mouth to hide the laugh. He wasn't impressed with your diligence and hard work? Lillian sighed heavily. One of his friends got to the note first. Oh no. And he read it aloud to the whole class. I was humiliated. There was my love in front of the whole schoolhouse, but worse, Benedict got teased. He stopped speaking to me that day. She looked down at her hands, sighing dramatically. I felt as if my life was over. Benedict, listening to the story as an adult told from her point of view, saw the humor in it for the first time. I decided you were dead to me. With those words, Elizabeth couldn't hold it in for another second. She covered her mouth with her hand to hold in the laughter that she wanted to let loose. Adam was the first to join the laughter. Dead, was she? Benedict looked at Lillian for a moment, a smile teasing at the corner of his mouth. After a moment, he too had joined the laughter. Lillian sighed, finally knowing she was forgiven. He never would have laughed if he was still angry. He spoke to me for the first time a few days ago. Do you believe he didn't speak to me for 10 whole years? Elizabeth shook her head, her face still red from laughter. I don't. She looked at Benedict. How could you be so cruel? The girl was in love with you, and you rejected her like an old worn-out shoe. She was the one who had her love bared for the world to see, and you were angry? It was your responsibility to get to those flowers first. Benedict leaned over and kissed Lillian on the cheek. I hope she can forgive me for my rude behavior. Lillian tilted her head to one side as if she were considering. I suppose I can do that. But you have to be nice to me from now on. Benedict put his hand over his heart. I solemnly swear that I will never be rude to you again. Lillian looked at Elizabeth. Should I believe him? Elizabeth frowned. He took 10 years to forgive you. You'd best forgive him quickly to make up for lost time. You make a good point. Lillian looked at Benedict. You're forgiven. Benedict hadn't realized he was holding his breath until she said the words he so badly wanted to hear. That's a good thing, he finally responded. We are married after all. For some reason, her forgiveness suddenly mattered to him more than anything else in the world. That's true. Elizabeth looked over at Adam. Oh, I wish they were settling closer. It would be so nice to have them around more often. It would, but they need to be with his family in Texas. Lillian looked at Elizabeth. Would you believe his sister married a man named Walton Dalton? I keep telling Benedict we should name our first child Drew. Elizabeth let out a choked laugh again. Drew Blue? Oh, yes, I heartily approve. Walton Dalton simply must have a nephew named Drew Blue. Benedict decided to ignore the women and their silly conversation. He concentrated on Adam instead. How's business? You seem to be even busier than you were the last time I was here. Adam nodded. I'm amazed at how good God has been to us. The business has grown by leaps and bounds. I have the most wonderful wife alive, 3 healthy children, and a thriving business. Who could ask for more out of life? Benedict glanced at Lillian. I hope I can say the same in a few years. So do I, my friend. After the meal, Elizabeth and Lillian hugged as if they'd been friends for years. I can't wait to meet the children at dinner tomorrow. Rose sounds like a lovely young lady. Elizabeth smiled. Oh, she is. I look forward to it. Sleep well, my friend. Lillian put her arm through Benedict's and let him lead her up the stairs to their room. I loved them. We'll have to visit them again sometime. I would love to come back here. It's a nice little town. It is. And we're going to have some pretty incredible memories of this place, he promised in a husky voice. Oh, are we? Definitely. He pushed open the door to their room and escorted her inside, immediately taking her into his arms. If you feel the need to change into your nightgown, now is the time to tell me. He leaned down and kissed her softly, his lips nibbling at hers. Otherwise, I'm going to keep you very occupied for the next long while. Lillian giggled. Would you prefer nightgown or no nightgown? She asked, knowing she'd cater to him. Tonight? He asked, his hand stroking her bottom through her dress. No nightgown. Then I don't need time. I just need you, Benedict. Lillian woke to a heavy weight across her shoulders the following morning, and she rolled over to see what it was. There, sleeping beside her looking almost angelic, was Benedict. She thought back to the night they'd shared and couldn't help but grin. She was his wife in every sense of the word now. She scooted closer to him and pressed a kiss to his lips, which were slightly parted in sleep. She couldn't believe her luck. The last couple of months had been horrible for her, but they'd resulted in her being married to the man she loved. She only wished her parents could have been there to see it. She snuggled closer to him, her eyes drifting closed again. She'd never felt safer in her life. When she woke again, the sun was high in the sky, and she was alone. She got to her feet, made use of the pitcher and basin to clean herself, and dressed. She was hungry, but she didn't know if she should wait for Benedict to return to take her down for breakfast or if she should go down on her own. After an internal debate, she decided she'd be safe enough going down to eat on her own. After all, Adam knew her situation, and he'd watch out for her just as Benedict did. Benedict stood talking to Adam, wondering how late he should let Lillian sleep. He'd kept her up half the night, so he felt like she should at least get to sleep in a little. He was hungry, though, and didn't want to eat without her. I really appreciate the advice you gave me, Adam. You were right. She's not a child, and it was ridiculous for me to hold a grudge for 10 years for something she did when we were so young. So thank you. Adam grinned lazily. She's just what you need in your life. I absolutely loved how she told the story of the note in school. I've never seen Elizabeth get so tickled over anything. I thought she was going to fall out of her chair laughing at me. Benedict shook his head. You need to take your wife in hand. You first. Adam said with a laugh. Excuse me, Mr. Brody, a voice said from behind Benedict. Benedict turned to see who was speaking. It was a woman who was dressed in the latest fashion. She had her hair swept atop her head perfectly. Benedict found himself comparing her to his sweet wife upstairs. Lillian was beautiful in such a natural way, while this woman obviously worked at it. There was something about her that he didn't like immediately. She made him feel almost unclean. Miss Schmidt. Back again? Adam's voice held just a touch of wariness. I couldn't stay away from your lovely establishment, the woman said with a smile. And please, call me Alice. She turned her attention to Benedict, her hand immediately going to rest on his chest in a manner that was much too familiar. And who is your friend, Mr. Brodie? This is Benedict Blue. He's here on his honeymoon with his beautiful new wife. Benedict, this is Alice Schmidt. She's from New York, but likes to drop in on occasion. The disapproval was obvious in Adam's voice. Benedict inclined his head. It's nice to meet you, Miss Schmidt. He turned away from her and back to Adam. Speaking of Lillian, I really need to go check on her. She slept later than I expected. He turned and hurried up the stairs, determined to get away from the woman. She made him terribly uncomfortable. When he reached the corridor upstairs, Lillian was just leaving the room they shared. He looked around him to make certain they were alone, and lowered his head to kiss her soundly. Good morning, Mrs. Blue. Lillian smiled, her hand stroking his cheek. Good morning, Mr. Blue. You seem to be in good spirits this morning. He offered her his arm as he escorted her toward the stairs. It must be the company I'm keeping. I smile a little more every day. When he thought about it, he really didn't have that much to smile about. His entire family was relocating halfway across the country to start over after what the deacons had done to them. He was penniless for the first time in his life, but he just didn't care. He had Lillian by his side, and that made everything better. His father had always said that a good woman makes everything better, but until this moment, he hadn't believed it. When they reached the ground floor, he saw that Adam was still talking to Miss Schmidt. He hoped that his friend's wife wouldn't be angry if she saw them together. Adam broke away from the woman as they got close and rushed to them. Let me show you to your table. I want you two to have the best table in the house. Couldn't think of any other reason to get away from her? Benedict asked in a low voice. She won't stay away. Adam said, obviously frustrated with the woman. Elizabeth is not fond of her at all. I can see why. Lillian turned around to get a better look at the woman they were talking about, but Benedict kept her walking forward. It's best you don't let her see you looking. She'll wonder why. Adam led them to a quiet table in the corner of the restaurant, handing them each a menu. Rose is waiting tables today, so she'll be here in a moment to serve you. Oh really? Your daughter Rose? Adam nodded. She's a good waitress. The cook was obviously trying to catch his attention, so he smiled. Enjoy your meal. Who was that woman talking to Adam? Lillian asked. Benedict sighed. He should have known that she would sink her teeth into the subject like a dog with a bone. She's just a woman who comes here to stay in the hotel from New York. Frequently. Lillian frowned. Something didn't seem right about her. She was standing just a bit too close to Adam while she talked to him. Does she have business here? Benedict shrugged. I really don't know. I was introduced to her and immediately left to go check on you. He took her hand in his thumb stroking the side of it. I missed you. He didn't want to mar such a beautiful day by talking about the New Yorker. Lillian smiled. Oh, Benedict. I'm so glad we're married. So am I. But I won't be happy with you if you name our child Drew. That is not going to happen. When he saw her grin, he knew he'd taken her mind off Alice Schmidt, and he was glad. The woman didn't deserve even the tiniest bit of their attention. A pretty young girl with dark hair, who looked remarkably like her mother, came to the table a moment later. Good morning. Papa says I'm to take good care of you too. Do you want coffee with your breakfast? Or something else to drink? Lillian made a face. I'm afraid I've never acquired the taste for coffee. How about tea? No problem, Mrs. Blue. Rose made a quick note on her notepad before turning to Benedict. What would you like, Mr. Blue? Benedict smiled. I'd like coffee, please. Are you ready to order? Rose asked sweetly. After they'd placed their order for eggs and toast, Benedict grew serious. I'm going to the telegraph office today to see if we've received a response from Gwen or Elizabeth Miller. I need to know that they at least received my messages. May I go with you? She asked. I don't feel like I've been outside at all since we married. I only had the short walk from the train station, and that's right next door. I'll wear my bonnet and keep my head down. I promise. Benedict considered it, but only for a moment. I can't let you do that. I'll tell you what, you can stay in the hotel lobby and wait for me. He knew he could get Adam to keep an eye on her there. Lillian frowned but nodded. She understood he was just trying to keep her safe, but she didn't have to like it. May I run upstairs and get my sewing so I have something to do? She wondered if Elizabeth liked to read and would loan her a book. She considered asking, but decided against it. I don't see why not. I'll let Adam know the plan as soon as we've eaten. Don't you think you're being overly cautious? She asked. He shook his head. I really don't. I think there's a good chance the deacons killed your parents to get their hands on you. If they'd do that, they'd go to any lengths to keep you, don't you think? Tears immediately sprang into Lillian's eyes. You really think they started that fire? Benedict sighed. He hadn't intended to tell her, but he needed her to understand the danger she was in. I went and talked to the police before I found the preacher the day we married. They found some suspicious materials, but they couldn't tie them to anyone. They're still investigating. He shrugged. Anything that's happened without any real evidence in Beckham in the past few years has ended up tying back to the deacons. Why did no one tell me? She hated that her parents could have been killed because of her. I'd have met the stupid nephew if I'd thought it would keep my parents alive. Benedict shook his head. But it wasn't a nephew you were going to meet. It was the man they would have sold you to. He's the slave trader. Thaddeus Slade was a man they were all watching out for. Elizabeth Miller's connections had mentioned him by name. I don't understand why you're talking about slaves. I'm a white woman. She frowned. Besides, slavery was abolished after the war between the states. She'd never heard of a white woman being sold into slavery. Yes, there had been indentured servants in the country's colorful past, but not for years. But this kind of slavery was never legal. They only deal in young white women. He squeezed her hand tightly. You did the right thing by refusing to meet the man. I promise. But my parents. She choked on the word, tears springing to her eyes. She could have saved them. Your parents would still be searching for you. Your father would probably have been killed, because he would have left no stone unturned in his search. He'd have discovered too much. Lillian brushed away the tear that had fallen onto her cheek. I just feel like they sacrificed themselves for me, but they didn't even know what they were doing. Think about it this way. Would your parents have knowingly made the same sacrifice? Lillian leaned back in her chair and thought about his question. She thought about the time her mother spent with her, just talking to her, teaching her things other young ladies didn't know. She thought about how her father had taught her to shoot a gun and ride a horse astride, so she'd be prepared for anything. Yes, they'd have done anything for me. Benedict brought her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers softly. They loved you. Sometimes I still miss them terribly. She felt almost guilty admitting that to him. Surely he'd understand that missing them took nothing from him, though. She still loved him, even though she missed her parents so much. Of course you do. Talk turned to simpler things throughout the course of the meal. Once we reach Texas, I'm going to build us a small house. It won't be anything like the grand homes we both grew up in, but it will be secure. The Dalton brothers have promised that we can have a small portion of their land to live on if we can't homestead ourselves, but I'm hoping to be able to homestead. What would you do with the land? She asked. She couldn't picture him as a farmer or a rancher. I'd probably start a small ranch, to fulfill the homesteading laws, but I think I'd like to be a lawman. Maybe have a detective agency so I can help people. I had no idea there were such bad men in this world, and now that I know, I feel like it's my job to take care of them. She shrugged. I don't care what you do for a living. As long as I'm married to Benedict Blue, nothing else seems to matter much. Benedict was astonished at the love she still had for him, despite the way he'd treated her over the years. Why, there'd been one time she'd fallen and hurt herself on the way home from school. He'd watched it happen, but he'd told his younger brother Percy to deal with it. He just hadn't been willing to get close enough to her to render aid. He knew it was childish and petty, but she was Lillian. I don't deserve you, he said softly, looking deep into her eyes. But I'm so glad I have you. Lillian smiled, reaching out to hold his hand. You deserve so much more than me. Once they'd finished eating, he went to talk to Adam and ask him to watch out for Lillian while he went to the telegraph office. Lillian went straight up to their room to fetch her sewing so she would have something to do while she waited for him. She wished she could go to a bookshop, but she knew that wouldn't be smart. As he was leaving the hotel, Miss Schmidt stepped out with him, taking his arm as she walked beside him. What do you think you're doing? He asked. He wasn't usually unkind, but there was something about the woman that made him feel like she lived to cause trouble. I need to go to the mercantile today, and I was certain you wouldn't mind walking with me. Was I wrong? I think it would be best if you went on your own, Miss Schmidt. He didn't care to be around the woman, and he especially didn't want Lillian to see them together. Oh, please call me Alice. Benedict wanted to push her away from him, but he was too much of a gentleman to do so. I wouldn't dare be so familiar, Miss Schmidt. My wife wouldn't like it. He hoped that the mention of his wife would make her leave him alone, but no such luck. Why don't I help you pick out a nice gift for your new bride at the mercantile? She asked. I need to go to the telegraph office and see if I've gotten a response to a couple of telegrams I sent yesterday. I don't mind walking along with you before we go to the mercantile, she said with a smile. Benedict sighed. He could tell he wasn't going to get rid of her unless he was downright rude. That's fine, he lied. It wasn't fine at all. He just wanted her to go away. He got both telegrams he was waiting for from the telegraph operator before they walked down to the mercantile. He went straight to the books along one side of the room, looking for just the right book for Lillian, ignoring whatever Miss Schmidt might be doing. He chose 2 books that he thought Lillian might enjoy and purchased them, hoping he could sneak out of the mercantile without being spotted, but luck wasn't with him. When he left the store, he again had Miss Schmidt clinging to his arm. He tried to ignore her and focus on his wife. He couldn't wait to get back to the hotel to give Lillian her books. He knew she'd missed reading. Just as he opened the door to the hotel, Miss Schmidt tripped, falling into him and holding onto his arm, her breast brushing up against him. He was sure it was deliberate. Are you all right? He asked politely, ready to shake the woman off. Oh yes, she said, simpering. I do love to walk and shop with a big strong man like you, Benedict. Benedict had enough. He pushed her away from him, looking around the lobby for Lillian. Please keep your distance from me in future, Miss Schmidt. I'm a married man, and I don't appreciate you throwing yourself at me. He felt as if she'd dirted him somehow. Why would a woman be so forward with a man who made it clear he was on his honeymoon? Lillian had said she'd wait for him there, but he didn't see her. She must have gone back up to the room, he thought. He panicked slightly, his heart beating faster, and he took the steps 2 at a time as he went to the room to make certain she was safe. Lillian reached the bottom of the stairs just in time to see Benedict leave the hotel with the woman she'd seen talking to Adam earlier. She didn't know why, but she didn't trust the woman one little bit. She hated knowing she was going somewhere with her husband, but she'd promised not to leave the hotel, so she couldn't even go after them and say something. She fumed as she worked on her dress, wanting to give Benedict a piece of her mind. Why would he tell her she couldn't go with him and then take that little trollop with him? It made no sense. She loved Benedict and she wasn't certain how he felt, but he felt something. He couldn't have been so gentle and sweet with her the night before if he'd felt nothing, could he? She'd just started to worry about him when the door to the hotel opened, and Benedict came in. Within moments, he had that woman in his arms. What was he thinking, holding another woman with her sitting right there? She hurriedly threw her things into a bag and ran up the stairs, refusing to let him see her cry. She'd thought he was a better man than that. Benedict Blue was obviously not the man she'd built him up to be in her mind. She sat down at the small table and took out her sewing, needing to be occupied if he came to the room. She wouldn't let him know that she had seen anything. Letting him know he'd hurt her again was not an option. Chapter 9. Benedict flung the door to the room open, slightly panicked. He knew Adam had promised to watch out for Lillian, but what if something happened? He would never be able to live with himself if something happened to his beautiful bride. Sagging against the wall in relief, he let out a sigh. I was worried something had happened to you. Lillian didn't look up from her sewing. I'm fine. Benedict frowned. Why didn't you stay in the lobby? I expected you to be there when I got back. Lillian shrugged, not saying anything. She didn't trust herself to speak without crying. He shut the door behind him, watching her closely. Something was obviously wrong, and he had no idea what it could be. She'd been perfectly content when he left her. Are you all right? Lillian nodded, keeping her eyes downcast as she kept up her slow, even stitches. She didn't know if she wanted to scream at him or cry for hours. Until she figured that out, she needed to stay silent. Benedict frowned but sat down on the foot of the bed, pulling the 2 telegrams he'd received from his pocket. He read Elizabeth's first. Landlady put out L eloped stop deacons angry, not looking stop. He smiled and looked at Lillian. Your landlady told everyone that you eloped, so the deacons are angry, but they're not searching for you. Lillian felt a small measure of relief, but her anguish over seeing him with another woman wouldn't let her be too happy. She simply nodded. He opened the second telegram. This one's for you. Lillian took the paper from him, careful not to touch him. She read it silently. Don't let me drive you crazy. Stop still as bossy as ever. Stop G stop. Lillian smiled. It felt strange to smile when she was so unhappy, but Gwen had always been able to make her smile, whether she was smiling with her friend or laughing at her silently. Gwen had always been a little prissy in Lillian's opinion, but judging by her letters, she seemed to have changed. Lillian set the letter onto the small table beside the only chair in the room and continued stitching, still not looking up. Benedict watched her for another moment or two before he'd had enough. What did I do to make you angry? I thought we'd worked things out between us. Had she not enjoyed their night together? Had he been wrong about that? Lillian took a deep breath, looking up from her sewing for the first time since he'd entered the room. She couldn't quite meet his eyes. I think you were right all along. We need to seek an annulment once we reach Texas. Benedict felt as if he'd been kicked in the stomach. An annulment? That's not even possible any longer. Lillian, I don't know what I've done, but I promise I'll make it up to you. Lillian shrugged. There's nothing to make up to me. I just realize now that we weren't meant to be together. She looked back down at her sewing. She couldn't believe she'd been able to get the words out without crying. I don't understand. I thought you enjoyed yourself last night. She grasped onto that excuse. It wasn't what I expected. And truly? It hadn't been what she'd expected, because it had been so much more. She didn't want to live without him, but she couldn't live with a man who didn't treat her as if she were the most important thing in his life. And Benedict didn't. He couldn't have gone off with another woman within hours of consummating their marriage otherwise. Benedict nodded stiffly, getting to his feet. I'm going to go for a walk. Stay in the room, please. I don't want to risk you, even if it does look like you're not in danger. Lillian nodded, waiting until he'd closed the door behind him before putting down her sewing and throwing herself onto the bed, sobbing. How could he have betrayed her trust that way? Where was the Benedict Blue she'd known and loved since she was a child? Benedict didn't know where he was going, but he didn't much care. He wandered aimlessly through the town. What could he have done differently to make her love him? He was surprised at how bereft he felt. For almost 15 years, every time he'd turned around, Lillian had been right there behind him. He'd gotten used to having her around, and suddenly, she was no longer interested in being married to him. Why did he feel as if he'd lost part of himself? He walked through town, past a small church, and to a park where he sat on a bench, just staring off into space. If he understood what he'd done wrong, maybe things would be different, but he was truly baffled. He knew she'd enjoyed their time together the night before, despite what she said. He rubbed the back of his neck, not sure if he wanted to kick something or just go and hide somewhere away from the world. Losing Lillian would be like losing his right arm. Why couldn't she see just how much he cared about her? He leaned forward on the park bench, his elbows on his knees, and his eyes staring at the spot of dirt between his feet. He didn't notice someone came along until he felt a hand on his back. "Benedict? Are you all right?" Benedict looked to his right, and there sat Elizabeth Brodie, just as beautiful as ever. "I'm really not sure." He didn't feel comfortable talking about his problems with just anyone, but Elizabeth was Adam's wife. Was she trustworthy? "Tell me what's wrong. Maybe I can help. You'll find I'm a good listener." Benedict studied her for a minute, sighing. "I don't know if it's right for me to talk about it." Elizabeth shrugged. "I'm not someone you'll see in your everyday life, so I'm an excellent person to talk to about it. Tell me what's wrong. Is something going on with Lillian?" After a quick internal debate, Benedict nodded. "She's been in love with me since we were small children. She wasn't joking about that note she left for me, or about my reaction to it. I didn't speak with her for a full 10 years. Elizabeth shook her head. "Boys sure do worry about their pride." Benedict decided not to take exception to her remark, because he knew she was right. 2 years ago, my 3 sisters were promised, against their wishes, to 3 local deacons. They chose to move to Texas as mail-order brides rather than marry them. After they were gone, the deacons put a great deal of pressure on my father to get them to come home. My 2 brothers and I were sent after them." He took a deep breath. "We tried to force our sisters to leave their husbands at gunpoint." His eyes met Elizabeth's. "Not one of my finer moments." Elizabeth's eyes were wide as she listened, but other than that, she showed no alarm at his story. "I suppose not. Well, my older sister, Bonnie, got hold of a shotgun in the kerfuffle, and she forced us to leave. We found out that night that all 3 of them were expecting babies, and we weren't about to tear them away from their husbands. Not that he'd wanted to once he'd realized babies were involved. Of course not." Benedict smiled at her, but his smile was sad. "When we returned home without them, the deacons made our lives miserable. They spread rumors about our family. It took a while, but their rumors managed to ruin our family business. In fact, my brother Percy took off for Texas with my parents just a few weeks ago. The whole family decided that without the business to keep us in Massachusetts, there was no point in staying. I was chosen to stay behind to deal with the sale of our house and tie up other details." "I see." It was obvious she couldn't see, but true to her word, she was still listening. "We found out, through a series of events, that the deacons were supplying local young women to a group of men selling women into slavery. That's why they wanted to marry my sisters. We have a woman in town, whose name is also Elizabeth, who is helping to thwart the slavers. I was on my way to her house to see what I could do to help her, when I found Lillian crying on the street. At first, I didn't recognize her because her back was to me, and I'm ashamed to say that when I did recognize her, my first thought was to cross the street and avoid her at all costs." Elizabeth smiled. "Because of what happened when you were children?" Benedict nodded. "Small of me, wasn't it? Anyway, I did stop, and I discovered that she had been pressured to meet the nephew of one of the deacons. She'd never liked any of them, so she didn't want to. They'd been pressuring her for months." He took a deep breath. She had just lost her parents and finally agreed to meet the nephew just to get them to leave her alone. She changed her mind the next day and went back to talk to them and tell them she couldn't meet him when she overheard a conversation. He grinned for the first time since she'd sat down. "My wife is very sneaky," and she stood outside the window, pressed up against the house where they couldn't see her. She heard that they were planning to sell her for a huge sum of money to Thaddeus, who they'd claimed was Deacon Smith's nephew, but I happen to know is one of the men running the slavery ring. Elizabeth's eyes widened in alarm. Oh no. It's a good thing you happened along. Benedict nodded. I took her with me to Elizabeth Miller's house, knowing that she'd help out. After much discussion, it was decided that I would need to escort Lillian to my sister's in Texas, but Lillian refused to travel with a man she's not married to. Of course she did. It wouldn't be proper otherwise. That's exactly what Lillian said. Anyway, I agreed to marry her, but didn't plan on staying married to her once we reached Texas. He sighed. I was honest about my plans, but she was having nothing to do with them. She knew that when she married me, she planned to be married forever. Elizabeth smiled at that. I can understand that perfectly. I've never seen a woman who loves her husband as much as Lillian loves you. Benedict shook his head. That's just the thing. I decided yesterday that I was going to make the marriage work, and that I didn't want it to end. I even told her I wanted her to be my wife forever. We worked everything out between us. Well, that's wonderful. Why do you look so sad, then? Are the deacons after her still? No, I got a telegram from Elizabeth that they're angry, but they're not searching for her. Elizabeth frowned. I don't understand what the problem is then. Benedict gave her a baffled look. Honestly, I don't either. Lillian just told me that she has no plans to stay married to me once we reach Texas. I'm not certain what I've done wrong. That doesn't sound like Lillian. Why would she say that? Benedict shrugged. I had to leave her at the hotel while I went to see if I'd received any telegrams. I needed to know if the deacons have someone chasing us. I also wanted to get her a gift. He sighed. I put her gift on the bed in our room, but I never actually gave it to her. Do you think it would help if I did? She shook her head. I just don't know. Something must have happened. I can't see her acting that way otherwise. You need to find out what went wrong. I've tried. She's not answering my questions, though. I don't know why. Elizabeth patted his arm. I don't know what to tell you. I think you did the right thing by marrying her, and I don't think you should let her get away. I can see what she knew from a very young age. You two belong together. Benedict nodded. I honestly don't think I realized just how much I loved her until Adam told me I was being stupid. Elizabeth covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a giggle. He didn't. Oh, he did. He came right out and said it too. No beating around the bush for Adam. Elizabeth shook her head. He must consider you a close friend to have been so blunt about it. I consider him a good friend as well, especially because he was so blunt about it. He really opened my eyes. He shook his head. She's been in love with me for so long, I feel like a part of me is missing because she said she doesn't want to stay married to me. It's like I've always known she would be there, loving me. I said I didn't like it, but I think I always really have. Have you told her you love her? He shook his head. Somehow I don't think she'd believe me. It doesn't hurt to try, does it? Elizabeth smiled. Tell her. Give her a chance. And if she still insists, you have to chase her. Make her realize just how much you love her. Benedict considered her words and finally nodded. I'll try. He didn't care about his pride at all if it meant keeping his wife. Good. She glanced at the watch pinned to her dress. It's time for lunch, so we need to get back. May I suggest you go upstairs and escort your wife to the dining room? Of course, I will. Do you want to walk back with me? Elizabeth shook her head. No, thank you. I need to go to the mercantile to pick up a couple of things. I'll see you at supper. Benedict got to his feet. Thank you. You're very welcome. Go get your wife back. Chapter 10. Benedict all but sprinted back to the hotel. He took the stairs 2 at a time and hurried back to their room. Lillian was sitting where he'd left her, calmly sewing. Her eyes looked a little red to him, so maybe she wasn't as calm about it all as she'd seemed. He picked up the books from the foot of the bed, where he'd left them. I brought you these, but forgot to give them to you earlier. I know how much you like to read. Lillian was surprised he'd shopped for her while with another woman. How odd. She took the books from him, glancing at the titles. She hadn't read them yet. Thank you. You're welcome. I hope you'll enjoy reading them. He'd bought them just because he loved her, using money he probably shouldn't have spent. Now, they were a peace offering. I'm certain I will. Lillian got to her feet, setting her sewing aside, and gently placed the books beside the almost completed dress. These will make the train ride to Texas go much faster for me. Are you hungry? He asked. It's time for lunch. Lillian nodded, astonished that she felt like she could actually eat. I am hungry. Well, the dining room is serving lunch now, so let's head down. Once they left the room, he offered his arm, but she ignored it. He took her hand and placed it in the crook of his arm as they headed for the stairs. We leave first thing in the morning. Do you still want to have dinner with the Brody family tonight? Yes, I really enjoyed getting to know Elizabeth last night. She decided not to fight with him in public by trying to pull her hand away. When they got to the dining room, she saw the woman who had left with Benedict earlier, and it was all she could do not to turn to her husband and kick him. How could he have gone from her bed to the other woman's side in such a short period of time? What was wrong with him? More importantly, what was wrong with her that she couldn't keep his attention longer than that? Adam stopped by their table as soon as they were seated, looking back and forth between them as if he could sense something was wrong. Tea, coffee, milk, or water? He asked. Just water for me, Lillian mumbled. She wasn't feeling up to talking a lot, and she really didn't want anyone to notice she'd been crying. As soon as Adam walked away, Miss Schmidt sashayed over to the table. Lillian was certain there was no other way to describe the older woman's walk. She walked with an exaggerated swivel to her hips as if she were trying to draw the attention of every man in the room. Benedict was careful not to look at Miss Schmidt. There was already something going wrong with his relationship with Lillian, and he didn't need to add to it by looking at another woman. Benedict, thank you ever so much for escorting me to the store this morning. Did your little wife like the gift I chose for her? Lillian raised an eyebrow at the simpering tone in the other woman's voice. The little wife has the ability to speak for herself amazingly enough. I am quite pleased with the books my husband chose for me. She refused to rise to the bait in the other woman's voice. It was obvious she was at their table simply to cause problems, and Lillian wasn't going to feed into her plan. He didn't give you the perfume I chose then? He must be saving that for a lover. Miss Schmidt grinned at the shocked look on Benedict's face. Please go away. I tolerated your presence this morning, because I feared being rude, but I will not tolerate anyone speaking unkindly to my wife. His voice was harsh, but he just didn't care. She needed to leave. The woman looked surprised someone would point out her bad behavior. That's not what you were saying this morning. She ran a finger along Benedict's arm, and Lillian bristled. I believe I just explained why I was kind this morning. Please leave. Benedict could see that Lillian was getting upset, and he didn't want that. He cared too much for his wife to allow her to be mistreated. Oh, but I was hoping I could join you and your little bride for lunch. You wouldn't want me to have to eat alone, would you? Lillian had enough. She jumped to her feet. He asked you to leave us alone. Please go. He's too much of a gentleman to ever hit a lady, but guess what? She leaned forward intimidatingly. Miss Schmidt looked at Lillian as if she'd lost her mind. What? She asked warily. Lillian leaned even closer to the older woman, ignoring the stench of perfume wafting off her. I'm not afraid to hit anyone. Please, stand there another minute so I can show you. Miss Schmidt put her hand to her chest. Well, I never. Lillian raised an eyebrow. And that's probably where your difficulties come from, Miss Schmidt. No one ever hit you like they should have. She tilted her head to one side. Are you still standing there? Really? Lillian reached over to the table and picked up her water glass. By the time she was facing where Miss Schmidt had been, the woman was gone. Benedict blinked a few times as he stared at Lillian, startled by her behavior. What would you have done if she'd called your bluff? Lillian let out a half laugh. That was no bluff. If she'd still been standing in front of me, I'd have poured this water over her head. She took a sip. I'm glad I didn't have to though, because I am rather thirsty. Rose stepped up to the table then, her eyes wide. Is everything all right, Mrs. Blue? Lillian started to tell the girl not to call her Mrs. Blue, because she wouldn't have the name for long, but there was no need to confuse the poor girl. Everything's fine now that we're no longer being bothered. Rose nodded slowly. Should I go get my father? Benedict shook his head. No, that's all right. My wife seems to have taken care of the situation. His respect for Lillian had grown a great deal in the past 10 minutes. He'd always seen her as someone who would let people push her around, but he realized that's not who she was at all. What other hidden depths did Lillian have? And why had he never bothered to get to know her before? Yes, sir. Rose seemed uncertain, but she continued on. Are you ready to order now? Benedict nodded. We're starving. While they waited for their food, Benedict studied Lillian. I've never seen you threaten someone that way. Lillian shrugged. You haven't been willing to look at me for the past 10 years. I doubt if you know anything about me. He frowned. You don't know very much about me either. She raised a brow. Your favorite color is blue, and you love dogs. You had a dog when you were a boy named Rascal, who followed you everywhere. You didn't speak to anyone for a week when he died. You always planned to take over the family business, so I'm sure you're devastated by the business going under. Your sisters call you Bossy Benedict, and Bonnie is particularly annoyed by your bossiness. When you get upset, you go for long walks with no particular destination in mind. You love to go to the beach, but aren't fond of the mountains. She met his eyes. Do I need to continue, or should I stop there? What's my favorite book? He asked, fascinated by her store of knowledge about him. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, she answered promptly. I even read it because I know how much you love it, but I found it to be boring and ridiculous. Benedict was humbled. He reached across the table and took her hand in his. You've been nothing but loving to me since the day we met, and I've been a heel. Please forgive me. I don't know what I've done to anger you, but I promise you now, I'll do everything I can to prove to you that I will be a good husband to you. Rose stopped at the table then, putting their orders in front of them. Will there be anything else? No thank you, he answered, waiting until she'd left to turn back to Lillian. Please, Lil. I don't want our marriage to be over so soon. Lillian closed her eyes and counted to 20. She'd spent her whole life following the man in front of her, studying him and dreaming of being his wife. Should she really throw it all away? What about the New York tart? Benedict stared at her blankly for a moment. The New York tart? You mean Miss Schmidt? Is that why you're so upset? Lillian frowned. I saw you leave the hotel together. When you came back, you were embracing. Of course I'm upset. She leaned forward and dropped her voice to a whisper. You left my bed and went to her within hours. Do you think so little of me? She felt the tears spring to her eyes, and she dashed them away, mortified. She hadn't wanted him to see her cry. Benedict brought her fingers to his lips. She came up to me and grabbed my arm as I was leaving the hotel. I was too polite to shake her off. If I'd known she'd talk to you that way, I'd have told her to go away. He frowned. And the embrace? She threw herself at me. Said she tripped, but I don't think so. Adam said she comes here every few months to cause trouble for the male guests. He doesn't have any idea what she thinks to gain, but she seems to just like making people angry with one another. Lillian studied his face, trying to decide if he was telling her the truth. She'd never known Benedict to lie, but what if he was? Really? Benedict nodded emphatically. I don't lie. I have a lot of flaws, as you obviously know. Being bossy is the worst of them. But I don't lie. What about the time you told your parents that Gwen was sneaking out at night when it was really you feeding a stray dog? I was 12. And Gwen had just told our parents that I embarrassed her at school. Lillian sighed. You did embarrass her at school. You shoved Bobby Myers into the wall for making cow's eyes at her. Benedict grinned. I did. And he deserved it. Lillian shook her head. I don't know, Benedict. I can't stay married unless I'm sure that I can trust you completely. Can we take it one day at a time? Give me a chance, and I promise you won't regret it. Lillian nodded slowly. I'll try. Benedict squeezed her hand. I can't ask for more. He took a bite of his pot roast. How about a walk after lunch? The deacons aren't looking for you from what we can tell. Wear your bonnet, and keep your head down, but I think we're safe. Lillian's eyes lit up. Do you mean it? I would love to be outdoors. I feel like I've been inside for a week straight. Benedict grinned. Between the train and the hotel, you pretty much have. He brought her fingers to his lips. I know the circumstances surrounding our marriage were odd, but Lillian, I'd choose to marry you all over again. I hope you know that. She had a hard time believing that, but she nodded. Thank you. Benedict frowned. He knew she didn't trust him completely, but he was going to change that. He needed her in his life. Chapter 11. Dinner that evening was a boisterous affair. Elizabeth's 2 younger children were delightful. 13-year-old Gabriel was his father in miniature, right down to the blonde hair. Hope looked a great deal like Elizabeth in coloring, but she had her father's features. Hope, do not throw another pea at your brother. Elizabeth hissed at her youngest. I don't know why you have to turn every spoon you touch into a catapult. But, Mama. He started it. He pulled my friend's braid after school today. Hope protested. I have to get him back somehow, did not. Gabriel protested. He glared at Hope, obviously embarrassed by what she'd just said. Rose sighed dramatically. Oh, you know you did, Gabe. Just because you think Jane is pretty doesn't mean you should be mean to her all the time. Elizabeth looked at Gabriel. Did you pull Jane's braid? Gabriel looked like he was about to protest for a moment, but he lowered his head. Yes, ma'am. Elizabeth looked at Lillian. Children are both a blessing and a burden. She shook her head. How I'll survive raising all 3 of them properly, I'll never know. Lillian laughed softly. I think they're more of a blessing to you. Rose shook her head. Not those 2. I'm the good one. I just help out here and read. I never get into trouble. Hope leaned forward. That's because Father doesn't know about the boys who fight to carry your books home from school. If he knew about them, he'd be very unhappy. Adam's head snapped to the side. Rose? Do you have something to tell me? Rose turned pink. It's not like any of them are courting me. They just carry my books. We'll talk about this more later. Adam turned back to Benedict. Children are a blessing, but don't have daughters. It scares me to think about what it's going to be like when she's of age, because she's had boys chasing her since she was 10. You should have had boys first. Benedict said with a grin. You have an older sister, don't you? Benedict nodded. Scrawny Bonnie. I was fortunate that my sisters who attracted men like flies to honey were the 2 youngest, with 3 older brothers to watch out for them. Adam shook his head. You really call your sister Scrawny Bonnie? That's terrible. We all have nicknames we use for each other. There's Scrawny Bonnie, Handsome Hank, Perfect Percy, Gorgeous Gwen, and Lovely Libby. And what was your nickname? Adam asked. Oh, that one isn't important, Benedict said, realizing just then he shouldn't have brought up the nicknames. He didn't want his friend to realize what his siblings thought of him. Lillian grinned. You left out my favorite. Bossy Benedict. Lillian wasn't about to let him get away with not telling his own name. Adam laughed. Bossy Benedict, are you? He really is. I've never met a Bossier man in my life. Lillian couldn't help but say it, even though she knew it would annoy her husband. She was still a bit angry with him for earlier. Benedict glared at Lillian. If you would just obey my every command like the good book says, I wouldn't have to get bossy with you. Lillian sputtered. Obey your every command? You married the wrong woman, bossy Benedict blew. How could he even think she would obey any man all the time? Rose watched the people around her, a huge smile on her face. This is better than reading. Oh, you like to read? Lillian turned to Rose. What's your favorite book? Little Women, Rose said without hesitation. Have you read it? Oh yes. It's one of my favorites. Which sister do you identify with the most? Lillian asked, excited to have someone to talk books with. Beth, Rose said with a smile. She's so sweet, and cares about keeping the peace. What about you? Oh, definitely Jo. I walk around with my nose in a book all the time and hate when someone tries to push me, or someone I love, around. Lillian grinned. It's a wonder I ever spoke to Benedict, because his sister was my best friend. Rose giggled softly. Was he really that bossy? Lillian shrugged. He didn't speak to me, but his younger sisters certainly thought so. Have you always known him? Rose asked. Lillian nodded. From the moment I stepped into the schoolyard when I was 7, I knew he was going to be my husband. Rose sighed. That's so romantic. Lillian didn't comment. She supposed it could be seen as romantic if one didn't know the entire story. She glanced over at Benedict and saw him watching her. Did he really have feelings for her now? Or was he just hoping for a repeat of the night before? After supper, Lillian hugged Elizabeth and Rose in turn. I'll miss you both. Do you mind if I write? Elizabeth shook her head. I'd love to correspond with you. There's something special about having a pen friend. Benedict's sister has been my pen friend for the past 2 years, but now that I'm moving to Texas as well, I'll need another. Rose bit her lip, but then blurted. How about 2 pen friends? I'd be honored if you'd write to me as well as Mama. Lillian smiled. I'd adore that. I will write to you both as soon as I'm settled in Texas. Benedict offered her his arm. We need to turn in. The train leaves early in the morning. Lillian didn't want to leave her friends yet, but she knew that there was no point in becoming upset. She needed to go to Texas, where she could be kept safe by all of the Dalton and Blue men. Chapter 12. Once she and Benedict were settled on the train heading south toward Texas, Lillian stared out the window sadly. She'd found some real happiness there in Topeka before Miss Schmidt had come along. Would she ever be able to feel the same level of trust for Benedict again? Benedict sat beside her on the bottom bunk. Are you all right? He asked, his hand going to her arm, stroking it softly. You seem really sad. Lillian shook her head. I'm just being silly. Tell me what's wrong. He hated the idea of her keeping something from him. He wanted her trust and wouldn't feel he had it without her telling him everything. I'm just going to miss my friends. Topeka was a mostly happy place for us. I'm not ready to leave yet. Benedict patted her arm. I can understand that. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. Does it help to know you'll see my sister soon? Lillian nodded. It does. I miss Gwen a lot, and I always liked Libby too. Not Bonnie? He asked, surprised. To him, Bonnie was the sister who would be easiest to make friends with for another female. Bonnie always intimidated me. She could do everything right. I always felt like I was lacking somehow. I can see that. He stroked her cheek softly. The sisters all live close. Their husbands each have homesteads, but they're connected, and they built their cabins close together, so they could easily visit back and forth. Do you think we'll get a homestead? She asked, wondering about her future. She'd always known she'd live in Beckham for the rest of her life, so she felt at odds. She wasn't even certain if she'd always have Benedict to lean on, and Gwen had always been flighty at best. No, I really think I'm going to offer to be the law for the area. Dalton is growing quickly, and with no sheriff to make sure things are safe, there's nothing to stop cattle rustlers from coming in and trying to take what they want. He shook his head. I know the 3 Dalton men are all crack shots, but they need someone dedicated to keeping the peace. What about you? Lillian asked quietly, worried for his safety. Are you a crack shot? He snorted. I'm the best shot you'll ever see. Other than Bonnie, of course. That woman can outshoot anyone I know. There's nothing she can't do right. He shook his head. It's enough to make a man worry that he's not good enough when his own sister can outshoot him. And that's why I find Bonnie just a bit intimidating. She didn't add that she was a crack shot herself. There was time enough for him to learn that about her if they could make it work out between them. She's different now that she has a son. It's amazing. She loves that little boy like she's never loved anything. Benedict shrugged. Even Bonnie goes soft sometimes. Bonnie? Is that even possible? Lillian shook her head. Bonnie had been the smartest in class, the best cook, the best at absolutely everything she did. Why, she'd even been able to beat the boys in baseball. Lillian had always felt like she was lacking whenever she was in a room with the older girl. It's definitely possible. Trust me. Bonnie as a mother is a sight to behold. What kind of mother is Gwen? Benedict rolled his eyes. She's a good mother for the most part. She worries a bit too much about how neatly her daughter is dressed, but other than that I think she's fine. She certainly loves her little girl. That's what it all comes down to, isn't it? She put her hand over her belly, wondering if their activities of the past 2 nights had caused her to conceive. On one hand, she wanted a baby desperately. Especially Benedict's baby. A little boy who looked just like her husband would make her the happiest woman on earth. On the other hand, she didn't want to have a child until she was certain all was well between them, and she wasn't certain if she'd ever be sure of that. Do you want a child? Benedict asked, as if he could read her thoughts. Lillian shrugged. I'm not sure, really, maybe someday. Benedict frowned. She said she'd forgiven him, but he wasn't certain that was entirely true. He hoped it was, but she was usually more forthcoming with her affections. Are you all right? He asked softly. Of course. She stood up and walked to her carpet bag. I think I'm going to read for a while. Thank you again for thinking of me and buying me books. Benedict watched her move across the room with a frown. He needed to do something to get her to love him again. He just didn't know what that something should be. 5 days later, late on a Monday afternoon, they pulled into the train station in Weatherford, Texas. Benedict was exhausted and his emotions were wreaking havoc. He couldn't figure out what Lillian was thinking. During the first half of their trip, she'd been so open, cornering him and kissing him. During the second half, she accepted his kisses, but she never initiated anything. It was enough to make a man want to scream. He carried both of their bags in one hand and used the other to help her down off the train. His eyes scanned the crowd. There they are, he said, pointing with the bags. Lillian followed his finger and saw Gwen standing there looking through the crowd. The man beside her was tall and handsome. He had dark hair and eyes. Lillian released Benedict's hand and ran through the crowd, all but pushing people out of the way. She threw herself at Gwen, who had seen her coming, and shoved the baby at Walt. I've missed you so much. Lillian sobbed into Gwen's shoulder. She couldn't wait until she could sit down with her friend with no men listening, so she could bare her soul. Gwen hugged her friend tightly. Is being married to my brother so awful? She asked, her voice soft and worried. Lillian stood up straight and brushed a tear from her eyes. I still love him, she answered simply. We'll talk. Gwen leaned forward to kiss Lillian's cheek affectionately. Yes, we will. She turned to take the baby from Walt, pushing her bonnet back. This is my little girl, Savannah. Lillian held her hands out and was delighted when the little girl leaned forward, a happy smile on her face. She's beautiful. Of course she is. She's mine. Gwen said with a wink. Lillian laughed. Same old Gwen, I see. Gwen shook her head. Not at all. I'm joking. She took hold of Walt's arm. This is my husband Walton Dalton. She rolled her eyes. Isn't his name just awful? Walt glared down at his wife. Stop saying that. I have a perfectly respectable name. If you're not careful, our firstborn son will be named Dalton Dalton. Gwen made a gagging sound. Thankfully, he goes by Walt, which isn't nearly as bad. Lillian was bouncing the baby, trying not to laugh at the couple. It's very nice to meet you, Walt. Walt nodded his head regally. He held his hand out for Benedict, who had come up behind Lillian. Good to see you. Benedict nodded. And you. He looked Gwen up and down. Looks like you haven't killed her yet. Not yet. Maybe next week. Gwen sighed, stepping forward to hug Benedict. My favorite brother married my best friend. Now why didn't I see that coming? Might be the fact that he declared I was dead to him 10 years ago and hasn't spoken to me since, Lillian interjected. Savannah had started wriggling in her arms as if she wanted down. Walt stepped forward and took the baby. I hope you're making his life difficult then, Lillian. I would love to watch him struggle for a while. Lillian smiled a bit. You don't like Benedict? She asked softly. Walt shrugged. I don't dislike him. Just feel like I owe him a little discomfort for trying to take my wife back to men who wanted to sell her into slavery. That kind of thing is hard to forget. I've forgiven him, of course, but I won't forget for a long time to come. Benedict closed his eyes, trying not to think about what he'd almost done to his 3 sisters. I'll do anything I can to make up for it. He met Walt's eyes. I understand better now. They tried to get Lillian. Gwen gasped and stepped forward, grasping Lillian's hand. Did they hurt you? Lillian shook her head, relating the story quickly. She bit her lip. Benedict thinks they started the fire that killed my parents. I'm so sorry. Your parents were good people. I liked them. Lillian nodded, tears springing to her eyes. I miss them. She couldn't tell Gwen that her parents had liked her as well, because they hadn't. Gwen had been very difficult to like. People had asked her many times how she could be so close to the selfish girl. We're going to have a long talk as soon as you're settled in. Gwen put her arm around her friend and steered her toward the wagon, knowing the men would follow along and bring the bags and the baby. Walt had placed a second board along the back so the other couple would have a place to sit. Gwen climbed into the back and patted the spot beside her for Lillian, accepting the baby from Walt. Lillian had been surprised to see that Gwen was wearing her pearls for a short trip to town, but as soon as the baby grabbed them and played with them, she understood. Gwen was using her necklace to entertain the baby. Lillian was surprised her friend would allow her pearls to be not on, but she understood her friend was a fine mother. They talked about their schoolmates on the trip to the Dalton ranch. Rosemary married Elmer Hopkins, and she's expecting, Lillian told Gwen. Elmer? I wonder if he still drools when he kisses, Gwen said, before covering her mouth with her hand. Walt had obviously heard her, and he looked over his shoulder at her with an eyebrow raised. Not that I'd know. I heard it somewhere. Lillian giggled. Gwen had kissed half the boys at school. I've only ever kissed one man, and I'm married to him. Benedict turned at that and winked at her. He'll be kissing you again later. Lillian blushed. I should hope so. She couldn't look at Gwen. It was enough that he was teasing her about their marital activities, but she felt strange that he'd do it in front of his sister. Gwen grinned at Lillian. Don't worry, he's always had problems knowing what he should say in mixed company. That's not true. Benedict protested. Gwen rolled her eyes. You know it is as well as I do. You just blurt out whatever comes to your mind. Tell people you're off to urinate and everything else. Lillian's eyes widened. He's never said that to me. I haven't said anything like that around a woman other than my mother or my sisters since I was 10. She's just trying to make me crazy. Gwen could get under his skin in a way his other sisters couldn't. Is it working? Gwen asked with a grin. Not at all. Benedict looked at Walt. I have an idea of what I want to do as my contribution to the ranch. Walt looked at Benedict skeptically. What's that? I'm the foreman. You can't be the boss. Benedict laughed and shook his head. Of course not. It's your spread, not mine. I was thinking I could be more of a lawman. Make sure no one rustles the cattle. Be the man with the gun. Walt shrugged. Can you outshoot your sister? Benedict slumped. I can outshoot Gwen and Libby, but no one can outshoot Bonnie. Walt sighed. You may have a point, she even outshot me once. He was quiet for a moment as he thought it over. Yeah, I think you can do that. I'll want you to show me that you're good with a gun, but we do need someone looking out for us. I haven't had any trouble yet, but I've heard stories from the other ranchers in the area, and we're starting to have trouble. I'll shoot for you when we get to the ranch. Benedict had never thought about being a lawman while they had their store, but now that it was gone, he felt free to follow his dreams. He wanted nothing more than to feel like he was doing good and protecting people. This have something to do with what's going on back east? Benedict nodded. In a way, I guess it does. I think I know more than most what to look out for now. How to do what needs to be done to spot trouble when a man just isn't expecting it. Walt shrugged. Makes sense, I guess. He nodded to the back of the wagon. You keep my ladies safe, and I'll be indebted to you forever. I'll certainly do my best. Lillian watched the scenery as they rode. She was surprised by how green the area was. In her mind, Texas was just a vast desert. She'd never considered there would be anything more to it than that. They reached a tiny town, just a small store, a saloon, pretty white church, and a few houses. Where are we? Walt answered, pride in his voice. Folks around here are starting to call that Dalton, ma'am. Dalton, Texas. Gwen leaned over and said in a stage whisper that she obviously wanted Walt to hear. Guess who started calling it that? Lillian stifled a giggle. Oh, it was good to be back with her friend. She wasn't glad she'd had to leave Massachusetts, but she was so glad to have Gwen around again. They were going to be just as close as they'd always been. She could feel it. Chapter 13. When they reached the ranch, Lillian was taken to a small cabin. It wasn't much more than 2 rooms, but as she walked into it, she was thrilled. Her very first home, and she got to share it with Benedict Blue. Yes, she was pleased. When Bonnie, Libby, and I found out you were coming, we all started sewing. She indicated the curtains at the windows and the tablecloth. We thought you'd be happy if you had some of the comforts of home around you. Lillian walked over and touched the tablecloth. It was red and white checks, and she'd grown up with white linens, but this seemed so much more homey. It's so nice to have my friends care enough for me that they'd spend their time doing something like this. I know you don't care to sew. Gwen shrugged. There's not much choice out here. I've gotten used to it. Why, you could almost say I don't hate it any longer. Lillian laughed. And you like to cook now, right? Oh, I wouldn't go that far, but I do love to bake. Walt has a sweet tooth, and I like to be able to whip something up that makes him smile. Gwen put the baby on the floor, and both women watched as she toddled over to the table and gave the tablecloth a tug. No, Savannah. Gwen reprimanded. You mustn't mess up Aunt Lillian's table. Lillian's eyes grew wide. Why, I never considered I'd be Aunt Lillian to your little girl. We're really and truly sisters now, Gwen. Gwen laughed. Spoken like a woman who has never had a sister. Trust me. In a few months, you'll want to go back to being an only child. I don't know about that. I've always gotten along well with your family. Well, that's true. You've never lived with any of them, though. Gwen paused, taking a deep breath. I need to warn you about Papa. He's different. He's extremely bitter about the way his life was stolen from him by the deacons. The deacons were behind him losing the store, right? Gwen nodded. They've done a lot to try to ruin our family because my sisters and I got away from them. They had apparently already found buyers for the three of us. Lillian sighed. They had a buyer for me as well. I know they were planning on getting a lot of money for me. Thank heavens my landlady put it out that I eloped. I don't doubt they'd still be looking for me otherwise. Gwen walked to the table and sat down, reaching down to pick up Savannah, who was ready for her nap. What exactly happened to have you end up married to Benedict of all people? Lillian quickly explained what had happened a couple of weeks before. He was just going to escort me out here, but I said I wouldn't travel with a man I wasn't married to. Then of course, he had to tell me he would only marry me in name only. Lillian made a face. He was determined to get rid of me once we reached Texas. Gwen raised a brow, patting Savannah's bottom in an effort to get her to fall asleep. How on earth did you get that hard-headed, bossy brother of mine to change his mind? Lillian blushed, not sure she should admit what her plan had been to anyone, even to her best friend. Finally she said softly, I set out to seduce him. Gwen let out a raucous laugh. You set out to seduce Benedict? How did you know how to go about such a thing? When I came here, I had no idea what happened between a man and a woman. When the baby stirred at her loud voice, she patted her again. Sorry, Nana. Sleep, baby. Lillian was careful to keep her voice down as she answered. Mama was very frank with me about what goes on between a husband and wife. I know most young ladies are shielded from the facts of marital intimacy, but Mama felt like I should know. She answered every question I had, and she made certain to tell me that women are supposed to enjoy it. Gwen raised an eyebrow. And do you? Enjoy it, I mean? Lillian blushed profusely. That's not a question I'll answer even for my best friend. Gwen laughed. I thought so. She got to her feet, cradling her now sleeping baby to her chest. I want to stay and chat, but the baby needs her nap. I'm going to take her home and put her down. Will you and Benedict come for supper? I'm making pot roast, mashed potatoes, carrots, and biscuits. Maybe even a cake. My friend is here and I'm determined to celebrate. Lillian nodded, getting to her feet. I'd enjoy that. I want to get to know Walt better. It's so obvious that you love him. Gwen stood for a moment. I do love him. Walt is easy to love. He's larger than life somehow, though, and I just don't feel like I'm what he needs in a wife. Do you know that he keeps referring to this ranch as his empire, and calls me his little empress? When I first came out here, I thought it was my due. Now? I know that I'm just a spoiled little girl turned ranch wife. I do the best I can, but I always seem to struggle with the right thing. I'd still rather sit for hours and make my hair look perfect than cook supper. Lillian grinned. Gwen. Do you know what all that means? Gwen shook her head. No, I don't. It means you're human. I'd rather read a book than work any day. Gwen smiled at that. Thank you, Lillian. I needed to hear that. Sometimes having Bonnie around, who is just so perfect at everything. Well, it makes me feel like I'm lacking somehow. Everyone has their strengths. Bonnie will never hold a candle to you. Gwen laughed. I used to think that mattered. She turned and headed out the door. Supper's at 6. We'll be there. Lillian spent some time exploring her small home. There was little in the way of furnishings. There was a bed, a table and chairs, a small rocking chair. Nothing much. At least there was a cook stove. Lillian knew she could learn to cook over an open fire if she had to, but she was glad it wouldn't be put to the test. She dug through the cabinets and found there was little to cook. She'd have to talk to Benedict about getting some supplies when he came in from wherever he'd disappeared to. She heard the sound of a gunshot and knew she had her answer. Benedict was proving to Walt that he knew how to handle a gun. She hoped Walt wouldn't be a difficult man to please. Benedict walked into the cabin Walt had told him was his. He called out for Lillian, wondering where she could have disappeared to in such a small place. He found her in the bedroom, sound asleep. The train travel had been exhausting for her. He was glad he didn't have to ask her to get back on a train for a long while. He thought about waking her to give her his news, but she looked so comfortable that he covered her with a quilt from the bottom of the bed instead. He was going to spend every day for the rest of his life proving to this woman that he loved her. He had to. Benedict heard soft footsteps walking up behind him, and he spun on his heel, reaching automatically for the gun on his hip. "Mama! Don't startle me." Mrs. Blue laughed, reaching up to embrace her eldest son. "Sorry, Ben. You weren't always so skittish." Benedict hugged his mother tightly, before standing and rubbing the back of his neck. "I've just traveled a long way, not knowing who was 3 steps behind me." Mrs. Blue's gaze went to Lillian. She took his arm and pulled him into the main room, keeping her voice down so as not to disturb her new daughter-in-law. "I always hoped you'd marry her." Benedict looked at his mother in surprise. "You never said anything." She shrugged. "How could I? You announced that she was dead to you 10 years ago. I thought if I told you that I wanted you to marry her, you'd just get angry and become even more determined never to speak to her again." Benedict laughed softly. "How did you get to know me so well?" "I did change your diapers, Ben. I've watched you grow into a fine man. I hope you know how proud of you I am." He looked down. "I said some unkind things to Lillian just before we married. You wouldn't have been proud of me then." Mrs. Blue sighed. "No, I probably wouldn't have. That girl has never been anything but kind and loving to you. She was barely into the schoolroom when she knew she wanted to be your wife. She's never wanted anything else from life." She shook her head. "I don't know why I'm lecturing you. I presume you've made it up to her?" "I don't know how. When the time comes, you'll figure it out." She patted his arm. "Bring her over to the cabin tomorrow, so I can have a nice long chat with her." "Yes, ma'am, I will." Benedict watched his mother walk away, thinking about what a strong woman she was. He admired her a great deal. No one else would have put up with Libby and Gwen growing up. He walked back into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. He wasn't tired, but he was drawn to Lillian. Wherever she was, he wanted to be. She stirred after a moment, her eyes fluttering open. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. I just like watching you sleep." He reached out and stroked her cheek. "I can't imagine my life without you, Lillian. I love you." Lillian felt like she was choking. He said the words, but she just couldn't believe them. Not after all they'd been through. She couldn't stop the tears that sprang from her eyes any more than she could reply to him. Instead, she got up and walked out of the cabin. She walked blindly, not knowing where she was going and not caring. Why would he say he loved her now? Because he knew it mattered to her and he enjoyed the physical side of their marriage? She just couldn't be sure. Benedict buried his face in his hands. He told his wife that he loved her, and her response was tears. Crying in happiness would have been one thing, but her tears had been of a different sort. He could tell her heart was breaking. He had to find a way to make it all up to her. But what could he possibly do to convince his sweet Lillian that she held his heart in the palm of her hand? Lillian wasn't certain how long she walked before she reached a fence. She leaned against the fence and sobbed her heart out. She couldn't live the rest of her life with a man who didn't love her, could she? Just 2 weeks before she'd been certain she could, but now? It hurt so much. Finally, she turned back toward the cabin, noticing the big ranch house in the distance. That must be where Gwen and Walt live, she thought. When she walked into the cabin, Benedict was still sitting on the bed, not saying a word. She walked to him and sat beside him, stroking his arm. She knew she'd hurt his feelings somehow, and she wanted to make amends, but words were still too painful. He turned to her fully, wrapping his arms around her and cradling her to him. Neither said anything, and he didn't move to make the embrace intimate. It was more about healing for both of them, and somehow both knew not to say a word. When they walked into Gwen's house for supper an hour later, Lillian plastered her best smile on her face. She hoped Gwen wouldn't say anything about her bloodshot eyes, although Gwen had never been the most tactful young lady she knew. "Is there anything I can help you do, Gwen?" she asked as she entered the kitchen. She'd seen little of the house on the way through, but what she did see hadn't seemed quite finished. Gwen shook her head, eyeing her friend but not saying anything. I'm doing everything tonight. Next time you come over you can help, but tonight, you're an honored guest. She pointed to a chair off to one side. You can sit there and keep me company while I make the gravy. Lillian sat on the chair, amused to see her old school friend actually cooking. Gwen had always claimed that cooking was for servants and girls who weren't pretty enough to catch a husband any other way. Supper smells good. Gwen glanced over her shoulder with a grin. Oh, it will be. Don't worry, I haven't burned anything in hours. Lillian giggled. You weren't exactly one of those girls who rushed home from school to help her mother in the kitchen. No, that was Bonnie. Me? I loitered after school, hoping the boys would notice me. Hoping? More like knowing. Was there ever a boy who didn't notice you? Gwen's eyes were dancing. Of course not. I wouldn't let them not notice me. I can't believe I mentioned what a bad kisser Elmer was in front of Walt. I'm still waiting for him to chastise me for that one. Lillian burst out laughing. Oh, how she'd needed time with her friend. He should chastise you for that. It doesn't matter how many men you've kissed. You can't go bragging about them around your husband. She leaned forward in her chair, her elbows on her knees. Does Walt drool when he kisses? Gwen laughed. Walt? He's like a male Bonnie. Does everything perfectly. Well, all except one thing. How is he not perfect? Lillian asked. She was surprised Gwen could see a fault in the handsome man. It took him forever to learn my name. He kept calling me Gertie. Lillian gasped. Gertie? But Gertie was my sworn enemy, and the reason my parents promised my sisters and me to the deacons in the first place? Yes, I know. Gwen shook her head. I thought I was going to have to write my name on my forehead. Benedict's got his faults, but he knows my name. Of course he does. He's been using it as a curse word for years. Lillian's jaw dropped open for a moment, and then she started giggling hysterically. It really wouldn't surprise me. Gwen joined the giggling and only stopped when she heard the clunk of boots behind her. She turned to see her husband. Do you think you're going to be able to stop giggling long enough to actually put dinner on the table? He asked. I will do my very best. Just so long as you promise not to call me Gertie. Walt grinned. I haven't called you that in over 2 years. Gwen stood on tiptoe and kissed him. You'd better not start up again. She pushed against his chest. Go. It'll be on the table in 5 minutes. Entertain my brother. He's playing with Savannah. Well, go watch him then. He's going to drop her. You worry too much. Walt looked at Gwen with pleading eyes. Is there nothing you can feed me? I'm hungry. You're always hungry. Gwen snatched a biscuit out of the basket she'd put them into and quickly buttered it. That's all you're getting. Walt took a big bite of it. Hey, sweet cakes? Gwen looked at him. This one doesn't taste like a rock. He delivered his line before disappearing from the kitchen, biscuit in hand. Lillian could hear Benedict complaining that Walt hadn't gotten him a biscuit as well. It's like they've never eaten. Walt is out working with the cows all day. He's tired and hungry when he comes in at night. Gwen poured the gravy she'd made into a bowl. You'll find men out here eat a lot more, because the work they do is so much more physical. I hadn't thought of that, Lillian said. So I should make more than I would have made for supper back home? Well, I never made supper back home, but Bonnie says she doubles what she'd have made for 2. Lillian stood and helped Gwen carry the food to the dining room and set it on the table. The table was already set. Lillian looked around at the room. She could see that it wasn't completely finished. How long ago did you move in here? Gwen grinned. The men hurried to finish it when we found out you were on your way with Benedict. We moved out of the cabin 2 days ago. Lillian couldn't believe it. You went through that much trouble for me? Thank you. Walt had come to the table. It was her idea too. Libby watched all three of the babies so Gwen and Bonnie could work on getting everything packed to move over. I'll have to thank Bonnie and Libby as well. Lillian looked at Benedict. I didn't expect to feel so welcome. Benedict walked up behind her, stroking her shoulder. They wouldn't have hurried if it had just been me. They wanted you to have a place of your own. Lillian smiled. I don't know what to say. Gwen smiled. You've already said it. Thank you was more than enough. Come help me get the rest of the food. Lillian followed Gwen into the kitchen. I really do appreciate it. I don't think Benedict and I would have done well staying with someone else. Newlyweds should always have their own space. Walt and I knew that from the first moment we were married. After Walt said the prayer for all of them, Lillian fixed her plate, eyeing the food carefully. She wasn't sure she could actually eat anything Gwen had cooked. The first bite surprised her. This is actually good. Gwen laughed. I told you it would be. Bonnie taught Libby and me how to cook right after we moved here. If Gwen still cooked the way she used to, I would have insisted on eating at Bonnie and Bart's tonight. Walt casually stabbed a piece of meat with his fork. Gwen's food is downright edible these days. Gwen ignored the ribbing about her awful cooking. She was obviously confident she could do a good job now. Benedict didn't say a word as he steadily ate his way through 3 helpings. When Gwen brought out a cake, he groaned. You didn't tell me you baked something. I'd have saved room. You shouldn't have been such a pig anyway, Ben. She served everyone a piece of cake topped with whipped cream. Benedict ate every bite before sitting back and rubbing his stomach happily. Good food, Gwen. You can feed me any day. Lillian raised an eyebrow. You haven't tasted my cooking yet. She had always been complimented on her cooking ability, and she looked forward to showing Benedict that she could cook as well as any of his sisters, even Bonnie. Benedict studied Lillian for a moment. I'll consider my first meal that you've cooked a treat, my dear. Lillian frowned when he called her by the endearment. Why would he do that in front of others? Everyone knew he'd hated her for years. She didn't say a word. She had made her bed, and now she needed to lie in it, with Benedict. Chapter 14. Lillian was truly surprised by the warm welcome she'd received from his family. She knew Percy had gone back to Massachusetts to be there for the sale of the house, and Hank was off somewhere doing God knows what. The others, though? They welcomed her with open arms. She had tea on Tuesday afternoon with Mrs. Blue and all 3 of the girls at Gwen's house. I wanted to have you to tea at my house, but Gwen has the biggest place, and I didn't think I had the right to keep you all to myself, Mrs. Blue told her with a smile. Lillian smiled. I'm sure the others wouldn't have minded. I would have. Gwen protested. I'm really glad you're here, Bonnie added. You and Ben are such a great couple. Just don't leave any more notes on his chair. He doesn't seem to like that much. Lillian laughed softly. She was glad she and Benedict had worked through that. She was surprised to see Bonnie light-hearted enough to tease her about it, though. Bonnie had been so serious all the time. I won't. I know better now. I would have been angry if Mama had stolen your first afternoon from us, Libby told Lillian. I always loved it when you and Gwen let me be part of your fun back in Beckham. Libby had often been part of what they did, but sometimes she and Gwen had shut her out at Gwen's insistence. Libby was a year younger than Gwen, and Gwen was always calling her a pest. I'm glad to see you too, Libby. Lillian sipped at the tea. Are all 3 babies napping? Bonnie nodded. We try hard to get them to nap all at the same time so we can have quiet time together in the afternoons. We like to do our work together, rather than being at home alone. Lillian hoped she'd be invited to spend those afternoons with them, but she didn't feel like she could invite herself. She was just a sister-in-law, after all, and one that their brother hadn't married by choice. Gwen read her mind, as she had so many times over the years. You're a sister now too, Lil. You'll be here, and that's an order. The others laughed. You're sounding a whole lot like Walt, Bonnie teased her. I think she sounds like Bossy Benedict, Lillian said with a grin. Mrs. Blue wrinkled her nose. You girls don't still call him by that horrible name, do you? Only sometimes, Gwen said, taking a bite of cookie to hide her grin. Lillian doesn't have a special nickname. Libby protested. Lillian made a face. I'm not sure I want one. Some of your names are downright mean. I agree with Lillian, Mrs. Blue chimed in. That sweet girl doesn't need one of your atrocious nicknames. Gwen leaned over and whispered loudly into Lillian's ear. We'll think about it and get back to you. Mrs. Blue shook her head. Will you ever learn any manners, Gwendolyn? Haven't you given up on that yet, Mama? Gwen asked, her eyes twinkling. Mrs. Blue gave Gwen a scathing look before turning to Libby. These cookies are wonderful. Thank you, Mama, Libby said, her eyes full of humor at the quick change of subject. Mrs. Blue turned to Lillian. When will I be getting another grandchild? I should think another boy is in order. Lillian blushed. I really couldn't answer that, Mrs. Blue. You do want children, don't you? Lillian nodded. I think so. I haven't been married long enough to think on it much. You were on a train for 10 days. Of course you had time to think on it. Well, I guess it doesn't matter if you want them or not. God has a way of making babies appear, no matter what their parents think about it. I love children, Lillian said, not voicing her fears. His family didn't need to know she didn't trust him. I wonder where Maggie is. Gwen exclaimed, talking about Hank's wife of 6 months. She's usually right on time. She went to the window and peered out. She said she might be late when I talked to her this morning, Libby said sheepishly. Did I forget to say something? Gwen rolled her eyes at Libby, reminding Lillian of when they were 8 and Libby was 7. Gwen had very low tolerance for her younger sister and always had. Did she say why she'd be late? I wasn't nosy enough to ask, Libby answered. She's allowed to do what she wants. Don't be rude, Libby. Mrs. Blue turned to Lillian. You'd think now they're all mothers, they'd have learned not to bicker so much, wouldn't you? Lillian grinned. I've always enjoyed their bickering. It makes them feel like a family. Just don't you start joining in. I don't want to have to knock all of your heads together. Lillian giggled. I'll do my best. She turned to Bonnie. You seem different here. More confident. Bonnie smiled. I am. There's something about being in love, and knowing you're loved in return, that just makes you better able to deal with life's difficulties. She set her teacup on its saucer. Benedict said the deacons killed your parents. I'm so sorry. Tears sprang to Lillian's eyes. There's no proof, but it looks that way. She shook her head. If only we'd known. She had no idea what she'd have done differently if she had known, but she knew it was something. Somehow she could have saved her parents. Mrs. Blue hugged Lillian. You can't think that way. It's difficult for all of us, what the deacons have done. But we're going to make good lives here in Texas no matter what. Your parents' memories will be kept alive in you. You'll tell your children about them, and they'll have a legacy. Lillian nodded. You're right. I know I'm being overly sentimental, but it just feels like I let them die. You did nothing wrong. The deacons are evil. That's all there is to it. No one should have to come into contact with that kind of evil. Gwen frowned at Lillian. I thought my life was ending when I was engaged to one of the lecherous old goats. I realize now that you went through a great deal more than I did. Lillian looked at her friend in surprise. She really had changed if she had empathy for others. It wasn't something Lillian was used to seeing from Gwen. At least I married my dream man out of it, she said ruefully. From what I hear, your dream man has a lot to make up for, Mrs. Blue said, squeezing Lillian's hand. His mother is not going to be pleased with him until he does. If he makes up for the past to please his mother, his wife will never be pleased with him. Lillian couldn't bear the idea of Benedict being kind to her just to make his mother happy. The door opened and someone Lillian didn't recognize rushed into the room. The petite brunette beauty hurried to Lillian's side. I heard that the deacons almost got you. That would have been terrible, she said gravely. I'm Maggie, Hank's wife. It's so nice to meet you, Maggie. Lillian studied the other girl for a moment. It seemed odd to think of Hank marrying. He'd always been the boy in school that the girls flocked to, which had pleased Lillian, because she hadn't had to be jealous about another girl's interest in Benedict. Maggie looked around. The new house really looks great, Gwen. I'm glad you were able to move in so quickly. Gwen smiled. Walt says it's more fitting for his empire than the little cabin we had. Maggie shook her head. That man isn't lacking confidence, is he? She sat down and picked up the only unused teacup from the table, holding it out for Gwen to pour her a cup. Thank you. Libby offered the tray of cookies to the recent arrival. Now if only Percy would marry, we'd have 6 sisters. Bonnie's jaw dropped as she looked at Libby. You fight with Gwen constantly, and you still want more sisters? What on earth is wrong with you, Libby? Mrs. Blue laughed and shook her head. Percy isn't ready for marriage. He has to realize that he's not perfect first. I'm not sure if that's going to happen anytime soon. Don't worry, Mama. I remind him every day, Libby said with a grin. Lillian hid her laugh behind her teacup. She hadn't realized until just that moment how much she'd missed being a part of the Blue family's household. She'd practically been a 4th daughter growing up, even though Benedict took himself off any time she'd been invited over. Gwen's eyes met Lillian's, and they were dancing with laughter. Welcome to the family, sister dear. Before leaving Gwen's house that afternoon, she borrowed enough food that she could cook a decent meal for her husband. Gwen gave her some salt pork, flour, potatoes, and carrots. Lillian knew she could make a tasty meal from just those few ingredients. After arriving home, she carefully rinsed the salt from the pork and fried up the strips of meat. From the drippings left in the pan, she made a gravy that she mixed with the potatoes she boiled. She chopped up the carrots and cooked them, putting them in a bowl to serve. When it was all finished, she glanced at the clock and sighed. She'd been over-anxious about making a good dinner for her husband, and she'd started much too soon. He wouldn't be home for at least an hour. She slipped the food into the oven to keep warm, before going to the bedroom and making sure everything was perfect. She swept, even though she'd swept just that morning, and made sure there were no spots on the windows. The cabin was so small, it took no time to keep clean. She didn't think she should waste her time reading while her husband was out working, but she had yet to get seeds to grow a kitchen garden. What else should she do once her chores were done? Benedict rushed into the cabin at the end of his day, inhaling the delicious scents that filled the air. If the food tasted as good as it smelled, then he knew he'd married a woman who would keep him content in every way. He already knew she could keep him content in the bedroom. He smiled slightly. He walked into the bedroom and found her sprawled on her stomach on the bed, her feet in the air. "How's my beautiful bride?" he asked softly. Lillian jumped, completely jolted out of the novel Bonnie had loaned her. "You're home." She couldn't keep the excitement out of her voice when she saw him. It had been their first full day apart since they'd married. Benedict opened his arms wide, and his heart filled with joy when Lillian flew into them. He rested his cheek atop her head for a moment, just savoring her closeness. "How was your day?" Lillian shrugged. "I spent some time with your mother and sisters, and I got to meet Maggie. She seems nice." "She is. Hank certainly loves her." She walked into the kitchen. "Wash up while I put supper on the table." He did as he was told, watching her move about the kitchen with the easy grace he'd grown to admire so much in the past 2 weeks. "Dinner smells delicious. I had to borrow supplies from Gwen to cook it. We need to make a trip into town so we can buy our own supplies." "I can't go tomorrow," he said with a frown. "Would Thursday be soon enough?" She shrugged. "I'm sure one of your sisters will give me food to fix for tomorrow night, and I'll just replace what we use after we make our trip to town." "Where will we shop?" "Dalton's got a small mercantile now. It's not much, but at least we can get the basics there." He looked at the plate of salt pork in front of him as well as the potatoes and the gravy. When she added carrots, his stomach flipped. "Did you remember carrots are my favorite?" Lillian blushed but nodded. She almost hated that she knew every little thing about him, and he knew nothing about her. Why, her birthday was Friday, and she doubted if he had any idea of it. She didn't want to tell him, but if she didn't, was there any way she could expect him to know about it? When she'd taken her seat beside him, he took her hand in his, and they bowed their heads to pray. After the amen, she waited for him to serve himself, before taking the bowls. "How was your first day on the job?" He shrugged. "It was interesting. I rode around the perimeter of the ranch checking for holes or cut wires. Walt's noticed that some of the cattle have gone missing, so he wanted to be sure that it wasn't an accident before we started looking for someone to pin the blame on." "Did you find anything?" He nodded. "Wire was cut clean through in the back of one of the pastures. I think someone has been helping the cows liberate themselves." "Cattle rustlers?" she asked with a gasp. "Either that or the deacons came to steal the cattle. We can't blame them for everything though." Lillian pouted. "I'd like to blame them for everything bad that's ever happened in the world." "You're not the only one." Benedict forked a bite of the potatoes into his mouth. "This is good." Lillian smiled. "You may not have married me for my cooking, but I've always been a good cook. Now I wish we could go into town for supplies tomorrow. If you can do this with whatever my sister had on hand, I can only imagine what you could do with things you picked out yourself." "I'm glad you like it. My mother and I spent a lot of time in the kitchen together, cooking and talking. It was our special time together." "Did you enjoy cooking with her?" "Gwen always refused to cook with Mama. She said she was going to have a house full of servants to cook for her, so she didn't need to waste her time." Somehow he'd always thought that Lillian was just like Gwen, but getting to know his wife had shown him she was much different than his selfish sister. Lillian laughed. "I think Walt is determined to make that happen, but right now, she's cooking up a storm." "She hates it," he said with a grin. "I love seeing her do tasks that she considered beneath her when we were children." "That's mean, Benedict." He shrugged. "I'm her brother. I'm supposed to be mean to her." After she'd finished the supper dishes, he held his hand out to her. "Would you like to go for a walk? Explore the place? Do you know whose house is whose yet?" Lillian shook her head. "No one has shown me around. They've been too busy making me feel welcome and making sure I know I'm part of the family." Benedict laughed. "Just like my sisters. They're too busy being social to be practical." "Well, not Bonnie, but the others. I bet they had a discussion about showing you around, and the others told Bonnie it was too soon. They needed to welcome you first, probably." He held her hand as they walked along, the sun slowly dipping down behind the trees that lined one edge of the property. He pointed out which cabin the family members lived in. All of the siblings were living in cabins except Gwen and Walt. Walt sent out letters to bring the other brothers here to Texas 3 years ago, and then he sent for mail-order brides a few months later. He didn't bother to tell his brothers they were getting brides, just told them to meet him at the train station. Lillian looked at Benedict in surprise. "Are you joking? That's terrible." "Not as terrible as Bonnie and Libby dragging Gwen halfway across the country by train without telling her she was on her way here to marry." "They didn't. That's the way I hear it. We found out later that Hank knew what was going on and even helped them get out of town. I'm so thankful that he did." "Because they got away from the deacons?" Benedict nodded. "I still feel guilty for almost dragging them back to Beckham. I thought of them as disobedient daughters, not as women in their own right. I guess I didn't think they had the right to choose their own husbands." Lillian frowned. "I would have been furious if I'd been your sister." "I know. They were furious. Bonnie held us off with a gun. I would have too." Benedict looked at Lillian. She seemed too soft to him to even know what a gun was. "Do you know how to shoot?" Lillian grinned. "I do. I can outshoot just about any man I know." "You can't outshoot me," he said with a grin. "Oh really? Would you like a demonstration?" "Actually, I would. Tomorrow at lunchtime, you may outshoot me." He wanted to be certain she could handle a gun. It would make him feel much safer if he knew she could protect herself. All right. After lunch, I'll show you how a real woman shoots. He laughed, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. You keep surprising me, Lillian blew. You grew up to be an incredible woman. Why, I got a bargain when I married you. How much did you say the deacons were going to charge for you? Lillian gasped in surprise that he would make a joke out of it, but then she laughed. Way more than you could afford. They stopped walking as they came to the barbed wire fence that separated them from the cattle. He turned to her and cupped her face in his hands. You truly are my bargain bride. I'm so happy that I was the one to find you crying that day. She shrugged. It's not like I would have married anyone else. It was you or no one. She knew she shouldn't admit it, but he'd known she loved him for over 10 years. Why should she pretend otherwise now? He lowered his head and kissed her softly. She clung to his shoulders, surprised at how sweet the kiss was. She only wished she could be sure of his feelings. Chapter 15. Lillian met him outside the cabin at lunchtime the following day. She'd packed a picnic lunch into a pail and covered it with a cloth. While she was showing him how well she handled a gun, they could have a delicious lunch. Benedict hadn't yet dismounted when he saw her running from the house. He reached down a hand and pulled her up onto his horse in front of him. Have you ever ridden? Lillian sighed. I was taught to ride and handle a gun at the same time. Well, I guess we'll see just how good your teacher was then, won't we? He rode them off away from the cabins, to a small clearing. While he tied off the horse, she spread a quilt on the ground and unpacked their lunch. She took out a jar of milk, a wrapped bundle of fried chicken, some beans, and a few biscuits. I had to borrow from Gwen again. We're going to have to double our food order tomorrow just so we can take her what we owe her. Family doesn't owe family, he said with a shrug, reaching out to take a drink of milk from the bottle. We'll shoot after we eat. An hour later, when they were headed back to the cabin, he was groaning loudly. You shoot better than Bonnie. Why didn't you tell me you were that good? You weren't in the mood to hear it. Lillian hid her grin against his shoulder. She loved riding double with him on the horse and being able to cling to his back. She felt secure being so close to him. He helped her down from the horse and carried the quilt into the house for her. Just don't tell my brothers you can outshoot me. Oh, I wouldn't dare. She grinned. Of course, you could tell them that's why you married me. It makes me seem like even more of a bargain, doesn't it? It does, although, I don't know that I want to tell them what you're worth. What if they decide they want to sell you? As if your brothers would do such a thing. She put the pail into the sink along with the milk bottle. She'd washed them before supper. She couldn't remember ever enjoying a lunch quite so much. It was amazing how good it felt to be married to him. Of course, when he decided he didn't want to be married anymore, she'd be devastated. Benedict saw her face go from happy to sad in the space of just one moment. What had happened? He pulled her into his arms, kissing her softly. What's wrong, sweetheart? You seemed so happy for a moment, and then it was just gone. She shook her head, unwilling to discuss her fears with him. She needed to just accept the momentary happiness he was offering her instead of worrying about the future constantly. Worry would only rob her of today's happiness. She knew it. She just wished she could put it into practice. When Benedict left, she took a few deep breaths and promised herself she was not going to show him that she was unhappy again. She would be a cheerful wife even if it killed her. Benedict didn't go back to work when he left the cabin. Instead, he went to Gwen's house. He pounded on the door twice before pushing it open. Gwen. Where are you? Gwen came hurrying from the kitchen. I was baking a cake. You know how Walt loves his sweets. Where's Savannah? He asked. She's napping. What's wrong with you? Gwen turned and walked back into the kitchen, expecting her brother to follow her without being asked. I'm worried about Lillian. She's sad. Gwen looked at him with surprise. Of course, she's sad. You kept telling her you were getting an annulment as soon as you two got to Texas. She's waiting for you to end your marriage. But I told her in Topeka that wasn't going to happen. I told her I wanted to stay married to her. How very gracious of you, Ben. Gwen rolled her eyes. Bossy to the end, aren't you? How many times did you tell her she was boring before you told her you decided to keep her? Did you tell her in that condescending way you have that let her know she really didn't have a choice in the matter? Benedict glared. I'm not bossy with her, and I didn't tell her she was boring even once. He just thought it a lot. Sounds to me like you are. She's your wife, not someone for you to walk on. Treat her like you love her. I do, he insisted. I even told her I love her the night we got here. Gwen raised an eyebrow. You did? Did you shout it at her? I could see you shouting that you loved her. I didn't shout it at her. I told her in the nicest way I know how. So you wrote it on a rock and threw it at her? I'm not 15 any longer. I told her in a nice calm voice, and then she started crying and ran off. Gwen sighed. Well, she obviously didn't believe you. You need to convince her. How am I going to do that? It's not like I have a lot of money to spend. Money? Why would you need money? Do something special for her. Maybe you could plan a surprise for her birthday. Something sweet. Birthday? When is her birthday? Gwen put down the bowl of cake batter, walked to her brother, and kicked him as hard as she could. She has known every detail about you since she was 7 years old. I wouldn't be surprised if she knows how much you weighed at birth, and you're standing there telling me you don't know when her birthday is? You do not deserve to have such a sweet, loving wife, bossy Benedict blew. Sometimes I don't think you deserve to breathe the same air she does. Benedict looked down, wanting to rub his sore ankle where she'd kicked him, but knowing it would just make her kick him again if she thought she'd hurt him. Please, Gwen. I do love her. Help me make her happy. Gwen shook her head. I'll tell you when her birthday is, because she deserves for you to do something special for her, but I refuse to help you plan it. It won't mean anything if it doesn't come from your heart. When? Friday. But it's Wednesday. Why didn't someone tell me sooner? Don't make me kick you again. You should have known when her birthday was. Do you even talk to her? Or do you just throw her over your shoulder and carry her off to bed like a barbarian? I'm ashamed to call you my brother. You married one of my favorite people in the entire world, and you don't even know her birthday. Benedict looked down at his hands for a moment, before looking back at Gwen, sadness filling his eyes. Thanks for the advice, Gwen. I'll figure something out. He left her house then, unwilling to take any more of his sister's abuse. There were some things he just wouldn't tolerate from the brat. As he walked to his horse, his mind was racing. How could he convince her? There had to be a way. For the next 24 hours, every time he saw Lillian, she was smiling and acting happy. They took a trip into town, and he helped her with the supplies, and she was thankful. A couple of times he caught a sad look on her face, but she immediately smiled when she saw him looking at her. What was going on? He didn't want her to pretend to be happy if she wasn't. He wanted her to be happy. He went to Gwen after they returned home, and he'd carried the supplies into the house. Will you invite us to dinner tomorrow evening for Lillian's birthday? I want to come here straight after work, without her, so I can surprise her. Gwen nodded. Yes, I'll help you. Do you want me to bake a cake? She still seemed angry with him, but at least she was no longer shouting at him or kicking him. Please. Benedict loved the idea. And would you invite the whole family? And Lillian in particular? I'll meet her here after I get off work. Gwen shrugged. Sure. Benedict left Gwen's house, pleased with his plans. He was going to make Lillian's birthday one for the whole family to remember. He talked to Hank that afternoon. Hey, baby brother. Hank wrinkled his nose. What? I have a favor to ask of you. Hank shrugged. You know if I can do it, I will. Benedict quietly explained what he needed Hank to do, ignoring his brother's laughter. He needed to make a spectacle of himself, and he could swallow his pride. It was for Lillian, after all. Benedict was at Gwen's earlier than anyone else the following afternoon. He checked with Gwen to make sure all the preparations had gone according to plan, and then he went into the dining room. He placed a note on the chair next to the foot of the table, the chair Gwen had agreed Lillian would sit at for their little party. His hand was shaking as he did it, because this was it for him. If he couldn't convince Lillian he loved her this way, there was no hope left for them. Lillian made the short walk to Gwen's house alone. She was sad but trying not to let it show. No one had remembered her birthday, not even Gwen. She dashed a tear away, missing her parents more than ever. They wouldn't have forgotten her birthday. They loved her. When she arrived at Walt and Gwen's house, she knocked at the door, and Benedict opened it for her. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Happy birthday, my love." Lillian sniffled at his words, fighting to hold back the tears. She couldn't stand it if he saw her cry again. The whole family would think less of her if she started crying, simply because he'd wished her a happy birthday. He put her arm in his and led her to the dining room where his whole family waited. He led her to a chair next to the foot of the table, and she saw a note on the chair. Just as she was reaching for it, Hank jumped up and took it. "Well, looky here. A note for Lillian." He opened it in much the same manner as Arnold had 10 years before. He read aloud. "My dearest Lillian, I know I haven't been the best of husbands to you, but I need you to know that I love you more than anything. I love you so much, I would allow you to name our firstborn child anything you want, other than Drew, of course. I love you more than life itself. Please forgive my idiocy, and let me be the man to make you happy for the rest of your life. I will spend every day making up for the past. I promise. A better bargain bride has never existed. Love always. Bossy Benedict Blue." Lillian looked around her at the entire Dalton Blue family watching her, and she immediately burst into tears. How could a woman respond to a note like that in front of others? She turned and ran from the house. Benedict's eyes widened as she ran. He'd thought it would make her happy to receive his letter, but instead it had only upset her again. He ran after her, determined to make her understand that the words were all true. Lillian was leaning against the front of the house, just waiting for Benedict to follow her. Surely he knew she needed to be alone to talk to him about his words. Nothing he could have done would have convinced her more completely that he truly loved her than the note he'd left on her chair. It was like history repeating itself, only she was the recipient of the undying love. As soon as Benedict walked through the door, she caught his hand and dragged him away from the house. "I couldn't talk about it in front of everyone." Benedict grabbed her to him, holding her close. "But you believe me?" Lillian nodded. "You're too prideful to do something like that without meaning it." "I love you right back, Bossy Benedict Blue. I may be the boring bride you never wanted, but I'm keeping you forever." Benedict cupped her face in his hands, noticing the tears shining in her eyes. "I'll never let you forget that I love you, I promise." He kissed her right there in the shadows of the barn, and she wrapped her arms around him, kissing him back. "I wish the others weren't waiting for us to come back," she whispered, "but they are, so we'll finish this later." Benedict raised an eyebrow, even as his hand reached down to pat her bottom. "Promise?" Lillian laughed, the sound filled with joy. "I promise. I want nothing more." They walked into the house while the others waited, all smiles. Gwen rushed to Lillian's side. "Do I need to kick him again, or is everything good? You kicked him for me?" Lillian asked with a laugh. "I sure did. He deserved it too." "You don't need to kick him." Lillian hugged her friend. "But thank you for thinking enough of me that kicking your brother was something you felt the need to do." "Oh, I love kicking Benedict. Anytime." Gwen stuck her tongue out at her eldest brother, before moving to stand beside Walt. Walt shook his head. "Sometimes, I'm just amazed at my wife's maturity. There can't be two perfect people in a marriage, Walt. Someone has to be lacking," Gwen said in a loud whisper that they all heard. Throughout dinner and the cake that followed, Benedict clung tightly to Lillian's hand. They'd had a few brief hours of absolute happiness in Topeka, and he wanted to be sure that this would last longer. Much longer. They walked home hand in hand. So do you have name ideas for our firstborn? Lillian nodded emphatically. Oh, I do. I have wonderful name ideas. She smiled at him sweetly. You can't name him Drew, he reminded her. Oh, no, I wouldn't do that. I know you don't like the name Drew. I have better names in mind. You do? Like? Don't you want to be surprised? They talked most of the night, discussing their hopes and dreams for the future. Do you mind living in this tiny cabin? He asked. I never thought this would be the type of house I'd offer my bride. I think it's perfect. We'll find happiness here, and that's what really matters. He smiled, stroking her cheek. I think I could find happiness with you living in an Indian teepee. Of course you could. Because I'm the love of your life. Lillian finally believed he could love her the way she'd always loved him. Thank you for writing me a note. How much did you have to pay Hank to read it aloud for you? Benedict sighed. I just had to ask. He was thrilled to be a party to my absolute surrender to love. He's a good man, that brother of yours. I'll find a way to get revenge. I mean, I'm glad he did it, but he didn't have to enjoy it quite so much. Lillian rested her cheek against his shoulder. I love you so much, bossy Benedict. I love you too, my bargain bride. I'm sorry I ever thought you were boring, because you're anything but. She laughed. Just because I can outshoot you, I told you not to ever speak of that again. You said I couldn't speak of it in front of your brothers. I don't see your brothers here. He kissed her swiftly on the mouth. Fine, you can speak of it when we're alone, but plan on me always shutting you up with a kiss. I can outshoot you. I can outshoot you. I can. Her words were cut off by his kiss. When he let her come up for air, she asked, does that mean that if I want to be kissed, all I have to say is, I can outshoot you? He just laughed as he once again kissed her thoroughly. Epilogue. Lillian held her twins in her arms, staring down at them in wonder. They were only 4 hours old, and she'd yet to grow tired of staring at their beautiful little faces. Benedict sat on the edge of the bed beside her, reaching out to stroke the face of the larger of the two babies. Which is the boy and which is the girl? He asked. The midwife had suspected twins for months, but he'd refused to believe it was even possible. When she'd come out with 2 babies in her arms, he'd all but fainted while his brothers had laughed uproariously. The bigger one is the boy, Lillian replied softly. His name is Truman. Benedict smiled. Truman Blue. I like that. He nodded to the baby in her other arm. What did you decide to name her? He didn't really care what their names were as long as neither of them had been given the unfortunate name of Drew Blue. Prudence. Doesn't she look like a Prudence to you? Benedict nodded, not knowing what a Prudence was supposed to look like, but happy to agree with her. She does. He stroked Prudence's tiny fingers that had somehow clenched onto her brother's hand and didn't seem to want to let go. They're both beautiful. He kissed Lillian's forehead softly. Thank you for giving me babies. I'd say it was my pleasure, but having them wasn't that fun. Making them wasn't too bad. She winked at him. Don't talk that way around my babies. Benedict said, looking rather alarmed. Lillian laughed. I think we're fine to say anything around them for at least a few years. She offered him the baby in her right arm. Do you want to hold Truman for a moment? Benedict looked nervous, but he took the baby from her arms. He walked with him to the far side of the cabin to look at him in the dim light of the moon that was shining through the window. Lillian snuggled Prudence against her breast, leaning down to whisper softly, Oh, Prudence, when your papa realizes what I've done with your names, he's going to kill me. But I'm so happy to have my little Prue and True Blue. She kissed the baby softly on the forehead, hoping it wouldn't be the last time. Surely Benedict would understand what she'd done, just as soon as he got over it. She'd loved him for 11 years. She knew she could outwait his forgiveness.